Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Vembo. It's been a while since I've done one of these, but if you've been around for a bit, you'll remember I used to ask this all the time. Comment where you're watching from. It's always awesome seeing how far these videos reach. Last time I asked, there were people tuning in all the way from Saudi Arabia to Egypt, which still blows my mind. Whether you're here to relax, study, or fall asleep, I really appreciate you being here. Now sit back, get comfortable, and here's the first story. Our first story comes from Jordan, and it starts with what should have been a normal day coming home from work. My roommate tried to turn our apartment into an Airbnb. I came home to find strangers sleeping in my bed. I've been living with my roommate Tyler for about 8 months now. We found each other through a roommate matching app, and everything seemed pretty normal at first. He worked in marketing, kept his space clean, paid bills on time. The perfect roommate, really. About 2 months ago, Tyler started spending a lot more time on his laptop. He'd be typing away at all hours, taking phone calls in hushed tones, always closing his screen when I walked by. When I asked what he was working on, he'd just say it was a side project for extra income. I figured he was freelancing or maybe starting an online business. Then I started noticing weird things around the apartment. New towels appeared in our linen closet. Fancy ones that neither of us had bought. Our coffee pods kept disappearing faster than usual. The toilet paper seemed to go through cycles where we'd be completely stocked one day and nearly out the next. The real red flag came when I found a laminated sheet of paper hidden behind our microwave. It was titled House Rules for Guests and included things like checkout times, Wi-Fi passwords, and instructions for the thermostat. When I confronted Tyler about it, he laughed it off and said he'd been thinking about maybe renting out his room occasionally when he travelled for work. That explanation seemed reasonable enough, so I didn't push it further. Tyler had mentioned a few business trips coming up, and if he wanted to offset his rent by having someone crash in his room while he was gone, that was his business. Last Tuesday I had to leave work early because of a family emergency. My mum had called saying my grandmother was in the hospital, and I needed to drive 3 hours to see her. I texted Tyler to let him know I'd be gone for a couple days, grabbed some clothes, and hit the road. The hospital visit went better than expected. Grandma was stable, just needed some routine tests, so I decided to head home Wednesday evening instead of staying through Thursday like I'd originally planned. I didn't bother texting Tyler about the change in plans since it was already pretty late. I got back to our apartment around 11 p.m. and immediately noticed something was off. There were shoes by the front door that didn't belong to either of us, women's sandals and men's sneakers that I'd never seen before. The living room had been rearranged, with our couch pushed against a different wall and extra pillows scattered around. But the real shock came when I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. The door was closed, which was weird because I always leave it open. I could hear voices inside, low conversation, and what sounded like a television. I stood outside my own bedroom door for a full minute, trying to process what was happening. Were Tyler and some friends watching a movie in my room? Had something happened to his room? Maybe there was a leak or maintenance issue I didn't know about. Finally, I knocked on my own bedroom door. The conversation inside stopped immediately. After a few seconds, a woman's voice called out, "Just a minute." A minute later, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, wearing pajamas I didn't recognize. Behind her, I could see a man sitting on my bed, also in sleepwear, with my laptop open beside him. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "but this is my bedroom." The woman looked confused. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake. We booked this room through Airbnb. Here's our confirmation." She showed me her phone with what looked like a legitimate booking confirmation. That's when I saw the listing. My bedroom, photographed and described as a cozy private room in downtown apartment. The photos showed my bed with different sheets, my desk cleared of all my personal items, my bookshelf styled with plants I'd never owned. Tyler had listed my bedroom on Airbnb. While I was gone dealing with a family emergency, strangers were sleeping in my bed, using my bathroom, and apparently had access to my laptop. I asked the couple to step into the living room, While I called Tyler, it went straight to voicemail. I texted him, "Why are there people in my bedroom?" No response. The couple were actually really understanding about the situation. They showed me their booking details, and it was clear they'd paid for a 3-night stay. According to the listing, they had access to the bedroom, shared bathroom, and kitchen facilities. The description even mentioned that the host would be available for questions, but preferred minimal interaction to respect everyone's privacy. I had to explain to these complete strangers that I lived here, that this was my actual bedroom, and that my roommate had apparently rented it out without my knowledge or consent. They were mortified and immediately offered to pack up and leave. But here's the thing, they'd paid for their stay up front, and it wasn't their fault that Tyler had basically committed fraud. I ended up sleeping on our couch that night while they stayed in my room, because I felt terrible about the situation they'd been put in. The next morning, Tyler finally returned my calls. When I explained what had happened, he had the audacity to act like I was overreacting. He said he'd been listing both of our rooms when we were out of town to make some extra money for household expenses. He claimed he'd been planning to split the profits with me as a surprise. I asked him how many times he'd rented out my space. He got defensive and said it was only a few times, just when he knew I'd be gone. But when I checked the Airbnb listing more carefully, I found reviews going back 6 weeks. People commenting on how clean and comfortable my bedroom was, how they'd enjoyed using my personal belongings, how the host had been respectful of their privacy. Tyler had been running an Airbnb operation out of our apartment for over a month, using both of our bedrooms and pocketing all the money. The business trips he'd mentioned were probably just him staying somewhere else, while strangers paid to sleep in his bed. The couple checked out that morning, and I spent the day going through my personal belongings to see what had been touched, moved, or used by random Airbnb guests. My laptop had different browser history. Someone had used my shower products. My favourite coffee mug was chipped. When Tyler came back that evening, I was waiting for him with printed copies of all the Airbnb reviews and booking confirmations I could find. The conversation got heated pretty quickly. He kept insisting he was trying to help us both make money, that I was being ungrateful for his entrepreneurial spirit. I told him he had 48 hours to cancel all future bookings and remove our apartment from Airbnb, or I'd be contacting our landlord and potentially the police. Having strangers in our apartment without my consent, using my personal space and belongings, felt like a violation I couldn't ignore. Tyler moved out the following weekend. Before he left, he had the nerve to ask if I wanted to take over the Airbnb listings, since they were pretty profitable. He genuinely seemed to think I'd be interested in continuing his illegal subletting scheme. I found out later from a neighbour that Tyler had been advertising our apartment as a quiet, professional space, perfect for business travellers. He'd been charging premium rates because of our location near downtown, and according to his booking history, he'd made several $1,000s over those 6 weeks. The worst part is that I'll never know exactly how many strangers have been in my personal space, used my belongings, or slept in my bed. I ended up replacing my mattress, most of my toiletries, and anything else that felt contaminated by the experience. That story is over. The absolute nerve of profiting off someone else's bedroom while they're dealing with a family emergency is staggering. Some people really will turn anything into a business opportunity, even if it means violating every boundary of basic human decency. Speaking of boundary violations, our next story comes from Ava, who discovered that breaking up doesn't always mean you get to keep what's yours. My ex stole my cat after the breakup. He said the cat liked him better and refused to give her back. I dated Cameron for 2.5 years, and for most of that time, we lived together in my apartment. About 6 months into our relationship, I decided I wanted to get a cat. I'd been thinking about it for years, but my previous living situations never worked out for pet ownership. I spent weeks researching different breeds, visiting local shelters, and preparing my apartment. I bought all the supplies, set up a litter box in my bathroom, and even rearranged my furniture to create cat-friendly spaces. Cameron seemed supportive of the idea, though he'd never owned pets before. When I found Luna at the animal shelter, it was love at first sight. She was this gorgeous grey tabby, about 2 years old, with the most expressive green eyes. The shelter staff said she'd been returned twice by previous adopters because she was too independent and didn't warm up to people quickly. I filled out all the adoption paperwork, paid the fees, and brought Luna home to my apartment. The adoption records, veterinary paperwork, and registration were all in my name. Cameron helped me carry her supplies upstairs, but legally and practically, Luna was my cat. For the first few weeks, Luna was pretty shy around both of us. She'd hide under my bed during the day and only come out at night to eat and use the litter box. Cameron would try to coax her out with treats, but she seemed more comfortable with me. Gradually, Luna started warming up to our household routine. She'd sit on my lap while I worked from home, sleep at the foot of my bed, and follow me around the apartment. She was still cautious around Cameron, but she'd tolerate him petting her when she was in a good mood. About a year into having Luna, Cameron started working from home more often. He'd spend long days on video calls in our living room, and Luna began keeping him company during his work hours. She'd curl up on the couch next to him, or sit on his desk while he typed. Cameron started bragging to his friends about how Luna had chosen him as her favourite. He'd send me pictures throughout the day of Luna sleeping on his laptop, or sitting on his shoulder during meetings. It was actually really sweet seeing them bond, and I was happy that Luna felt comfortable with both of us. When Cameron and I started having relationship problems earlier this year, Luna seemed to pick up on the tension in the apartment. She'd disappear whenever we had arguments and started spending more time hiding in my bedroom closet. The breakup itself was pretty messy. We'd been growing apart for months, and there were trust issues that we couldn't seem to resolve. When we finally decided to end things, Cameron said he'd move out by the end of the month. I assumed the logistics would be straightforward. Cameron would take his belongings, I'd keep my apartment and my cat, and we'd both move on with our lives. Most of his stuff was clearly his, and most of mine was clearly mine. But when moving day arrived, Cameron started packing up Luna's supplies, along with his own belongings. Her food bowls, her favourite toys, even her litter box. When I asked what he was doing, he said Luna was coming with him. I reminded him that Luna was my cat, that I'd adopted her, paid for all her veterinary care, and that all her paperwork was in my name. Cameron argued that Luna had bonded with him more over the past year, that she spent more time with him during the day, and that it would be cruel to separate them. This turned into a huge fight. Cameron insisted that Luna chose him and that I was being selfish by not letting her go where she'd be happiest. I pointed out that Luna lived in my apartment, that I'd made the commitment to care for her, and that pets aren't just transferred based on who they seem to like. More on any given day. Cameron eventually left without Luna that day, but he kept texting me about it. He sent me articles about how cats form primary bonds with specific humans, how forcing a cat to stay with the wrong person could cause behavioural problems, and how I should consider what was best for Luna rather than being possessive. A week later, I came home from work to find my apartment door unlocked and Luna missing. Nothing else was taken, but Luna's carrier was gone, along with some of her toys and her favourite blanket. I immediately called Cameron. He admitted he'd taken Luna, saying he still had a key to my apartment and that he'd come to rescue her from what he called an unhealthy situation. He said Luna had seemed depressed since he'd moved out, and that she obviously wanted to be with him. I told him he'd committed breaking and entering and theft, and that he needed to return Luna immediately. Cameron refused, saying he'd given me a week to do the right thing, and since I hadn't, he'd taken matters into his own hands. When I threatened to call the police, Cameron said he'd claimed that Luna was his cat too, that we'd adopted her together, and that it would be my word against his. He said the police wouldn't get involved in what looked like a relationship dispute over a pet. I spent the next few days calling every authority I could think of. The police said that without clear proof of ownership, they couldn't treat it as theft. The animal shelter, where I'd adopted Luna, said they could provide records showing the adoption was in my name, but that they couldn't physically retrieve Luna from Cameron. Meanwhile, Cameron started posting pictures on social media of Luna in his new apartment, with captions about how happy she looked in her new home. He'd taken her to a different veterinarian and was trying to establish a paper trail showing that he was her primary caretaker. I hired a lawyer who specialised in pet custody cases. Yes, that's apparently a thing that exists now. She explained that legally, pets are considered property, and since I had all the original adoption and veterinary records, I had a strong case for Luna's return. The lawyer sent Cameron a formal demand letter requiring him to return Luna within 72 hours or face legal action for theft and trespassing. Cameron's response was to block me on all social media and change his phone number. Through mutual friends, I learned that Cameron was telling people I'd been neglectful of Luna, that she was happier with him, and that he was protecting her from an unstable living situation. He was painting himself as Luna's rescuer and me as some kind of unfit pet owner. The legal process took almost 2 months. During that time, I had no contact with Luna and no way of knowing how she was doing. I'd catch glimpses of her in Cameron's social media posts through friends' accounts, and she looked fine, but I was worried about her emotional well-being and missing her constantly. Finally, we got a court order requiring Cameron to return Luna to me. When the sheriff's deputy showed up at Cameron's apartment to enforce the order, Cameron tried one last manipulation tactic. He claimed that Luna was traumatized by being forced to leave, and that I was causing her psychological harm. The deputy wasn't interested in Cameron's theories about cat psychology. Luna was legally my property. I had documentation proving ownership, and Cameron had unlawfully taken her from my apartment. Luna came home with me that day. When I got Luna back, she seemed confused but not traumatized. She spent the first few hours hiding under my bed, probably wondering why her environment kept changing. But by that evening, she was back to her normal routine, curling up on my lap and sleeping in her usual spot. Cameron continued trying to contact me for weeks after Luna's return, sending messages through friends about how much he missed her and asking if he could have visitation rights. I blocked him everywhere and made it clear that our relationship was completely over. The whole experience cost me almost $3,000 in legal fees and caused months of stress and anxiety. But more than that, it showed me a side of Cameron that I'd never seen before. Someone who would break into my apartment, steal my pet, and then try to manipulate the situation to make himself look like the victim. Luna and I are doing great now. She seems to have forgotten all about Cameron and has gone back to her independent, slightly aloof personality. Sometimes, I wonder if she actually preferred him, or if that was just Cameron's projection. But honestly, it doesn't matter. She's my cat, she's home, and that's what matters. That story is over. The entitlement of stealing someone's pet and then claiming it's for the animal's own good is breathtaking. Imagine having to hire a lawyer and get a court order just to get your own cat back from someone who thinks pet custody works like a popularity contest. Our next story comes from Matt, who learned that some employers think work should come before everything else, even family tragedies. My boss forced me to work during my grandma's funeral. When I didn't show, he fired me for being unreliable. I've been working at this marketing agency for about 2 years now. It's not my dream job, but the pay is decent, and my boss, Richard, seemed reasonable enough when I first started. He runs a pretty tight ship, expects everyone to be available during business hours, but I thought that was just standard professional expectations. My grandmother raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She was basically my mother, father, and best friend all rolled into one person. When she got sick last month, I used all my vacation days to help take care of her and spend time together while she was still lucid. 3 weeks ago, my grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep. I was devastated, but also grateful that she didn't suffer at the end. The funeral was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I immediately sent an email to Richard explaining the situation and requesting the day off for the service. Richard's response was immediate and cold. He said Thursday was our biggest client presentation of the quarter, that I was the lead on the project, and that my grandmother wouldn't want me to jeopardize my career over something I couldn't control. He suggested I attend a later memorial service instead of the actual funeral. I tried to explain that there wouldn't be a later service, that this was the only funeral, and that I needed to be there to help my family get through this difficult time. Richard said he understood my loss, but that business obligations had to come first, especially when other people were counting on me. The client presentation was important. I knew that. I'd been working on it for months, and it could potentially bring in a lot of revenue for the company. But this was my grandmother's funeral, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise me after I lost my parents. I offered every compromise I could think of. I'd work late every night leading up to Thursday to make sure everything was perfect. I'd be available by phone during the funeral if any last-minute questions came up. I'd even come in early Friday morning to handle any follow-up the client needed. Richard rejected every suggestion. He said the client specifically requested that I be present for the presentation, that sending someone else would look unprofessional, and that taking the day off would show a lack of commitment to my role at the company. Wednesday night, I was up until 3 a.m. putting together the most comprehensive presentation materials I'd ever created. I wrote detailed notes for every slide, anticipated every possible question the client might ask, and prepared backup plans for scenarios I could barely imagine happening. I sent everything to Richard and my co-worker Kevin, who would be covering for me during the presentation. I included step-by-step instructions, contact information for all the vendors involved, and even scripts for how to handle different client reactions. Thursday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Richard. I called him back while I was getting dressed for the funeral. He was furious, screaming about how I was abandoning the team and putting my personal life ahead of professional responsibilities. I tried to stay calm and reminded him that I prepared everything thoroughly, that Kevin was fully briefed on the project, and that the client presentation could proceed without me. Richard said that wasn't the point, that showing up was about more than just the work itself. Your grandmother is already dead, he said. She won't know if you're at the funeral or not. But this client will definitely notice if you're not at this presentation. I hung up on him. I'd never hung up on a boss before, but hearing him talk about my grandmother that way made me sick to my stomach. I turned off my phone and went to say goodbye to the most important person in my life. The funeral was beautiful. My grandmother had specifically requested that it be a celebration of her life, rather than a somber affair. We shared stories about her terrible cooking, her obsession with game shows, and the way she'd sneak candy to neighborhood kids, even though their parents told her not to. I gave a eulogy about how she'd taught me that family comes first, that being a good person matters more than being successful, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just show up for the people you love. During the reception afterward, I finally turned my phone back on. 43 missed calls from Richard, dozens of increasingly angry text messages, and an email with the subject line, "Final warning." Richard had apparently spent the entire day calling me, even during the client presentation. Kevin told me later that Richard kept interrupting the meeting to try calling me, explaining to the client that his lead project manager was dealing with a personal emergency, but would be reached shortly. The client presentation went fine without me. Kevin handled everything perfectly. The client was happy with our proposal, and we ended up winning the contract. But Richard was livid that I hadn't answered his calls during my grandmother's funeral. Friday morning, I came into work early as promised, ready to handle any follow-up from the client and get back to normal business operations. Richard called me into his office immediately. He said my behaviour on Thursday was completely unacceptable, that I'd shown a fundamental lack of professionalism and commitment to the company. He said he couldn't trust me to prioritise work responsibilities over personal issues, and that kind of unreliability had no place in his organisation. I was fired on the spot. Richard said he was terminating me for abandoning my duties during a critical business situation and for being unresponsive to urgent communications from management. He had security escort me out of the building like I was some kind of threat. The worst part was that Richard made a point of telling the rest of the team exactly why I'd been fired. He sent a company-wide email explaining that I'd been let go for failing to fulfill essential job duties during a crucial client presentation, and that my termination should serve as a reminder about the importance of professional dedication. He made it sound like I'd just skipped work on a whim, not that I'd attended my grandmother's funeral after losing the person who raised me. My former co-workers were confused and horrified when they learned the real reason behind my firing. Kevin reached out to me privately and said several people in the office were considering quitting over Richard's handling of the situation. Apparently, Richard spent the week after my firing bragging about how he'd sent a message about priorities and commitment. I filed for unemployment benefits, but Richard contested the claim, arguing that I'd been fired for cause due to job abandonment. I had to provide documentation about my grandmother's death and funeral to prove that my absence was legitimate and not just an excuse to skip work. The unemployment office sided with me, recognizing that attending a family funeral was a reasonable use of bereavement time, especially since I'd requested the day off in advance and made arrangements for coverage. Richard's contest was denied, and I was approved for benefits. 3 months later, I found a much better job at a company that actually values work-life balance and treats employees like human beings rather than machines. When they asked why I'd left my previous position, I told them honestly about the situation with my grandmother's funeral. My new boss was appalled by Richard's behaviour and said that any manager who would fire someone for attending a family funeral was clearly not someone worth working for. She said their company policy specifically guarantees bereavement leave for situations exactly like mine. I heard through mutual connections that Richard's company lost 3 more employees in the months after I was fired, all citing concerns about management's treatment of staff during personal emergencies. Apparently, word got around in our industry about what had happened, and it's been affecting their ability to recruit quality talent. Looking back, I'm grateful that Richard showed his true colours when he did. Working for someone who thinks a client presentation is more important than saying "who raised you" is not goodbye to the person sustainable in the long run. My grandmother would have been proud that I chose family over. It cost me my job. That story is over a paycheck, even when imagine firing someone for attending their then bra grandmother's funeral, anging about sending a message about priorities. Some managers are so power drunk, they forget their employees are actual human beings, with real lives outside of spreadsheets and presentations. Let's move to our next story from Ethan, who discovered that some people will go to incredible lengths to sabotage relationships they have nothing to do with. My brother's girlfriend tried to frame me for cheating. She sent fake texts to my girlfriend, pretending to be me. My brother Connor and I have always been close, despite our 3-year age gap. When he started dating Melissa about a year ago, I was happy for him. She seemed nice enough at first, though I noticed she had some jealousy issues when it came to Connor spending time with family or friends. I've been with my girlfriend Rachel for 2 years now, and we have a really solid relationship built on trust and communication. Rachel knew about Connor and Melissa, had met them at a few family gatherings, and everything seemed normal on the surface. The problem started about 6 months ago when Melissa began making weird comments about Rachel and me. She'd suggest that Rachel seemed too good to be true, or that she was probably talking to other guys behind my back. When I'd defend Rachel, Melissa would act like she was just looking out for me as family. Melissa also started inserting herself into conversations between Connor and me, especially when we talk about our relationships. If I mentioned something nice Rachel had done, Melissa would make some passive-aggressive comment about how some girls are just better at hiding things. I started noticing that Melissa would get really interested whenever I got text messages from Rachel. She'd try to peek at my phone screen or ask who I was texting, even when it was obviously none of her business. When I'd put my phone face down, she'd make jokes about me being secretive. 3 months ago, Melissa started asking really specific questions about Rachel's work schedule, her friends, and where she spent time when we weren't together. She'd frame it as just being friendly and wanting to get to know Rachel better, but something about her interest felt invasive. The situation escalated when Melissa began suggesting group hangouts where she could observe Rachel's behaviour around other people. She'd invite us to parties or bars where there would be lots of guys, then spend the evening watching Rachel's interactions and making comments later about how flirty she seemed. Last month, things came to a head when Melissa directly told Connor that she thought Rachel was cheating on me. She claimed she'd seen Rachel at a restaurant with another guy, holding hands and acting couple-like. When Connor asked for details, Melissa's story kept changing, but she insisted she was certain about what she'd seen. Connor came to me with Melissa's accusation, but he was clearly uncomfortable about it. He said he didn't want to cause problems between Rachel and me, but that Melissa seemed genuinely concerned and thought I deserved to know what she'd witnessed. I knew the accusation was false because Rachel and I spend most of our free time together, and on the specific day Melissa claimed to have seen her with someone else, Rachel had been at her sister's baby shower. I had pictures from the event and multiple witnesses who could confirm Rachel's whereabouts. When I confronted Melissa about her lie, she backtracked and said maybe she'd been mistaken about the date, or maybe it had been someone who just looked like Rachel, but she maintained that she was pretty sure she'd seen Rachel being inappropriate with another man at some point. I told Connor that his girlfriend was making false accusations about Rachel and that her behaviour was becoming a problem for our family relationships. Connor said he'd talked to Melissa about backing off, but that he thought she was just trying to be protective of me. 2 weeks later, Rachel came to me in tears with screenshots of text messages that had supposedly been sent from my phone number. The messages were sexual in nature and directed at someone named Ashley, discussing plans to meet up while Rachel was out of town for work. The text looked legitimate, complete with my contact information and even some personal details that made them seem authentic. But I hadn't sent any of these messages, had never heard of anyone named Ashley, and was completely baffled about how Rachel had received screenshots of conversations I'd never had. Rachel was devastated, but trying to give me a chance to explain. She said the messages had been forwarded to her by an anonymous number, along with a note saying, "Thought you should know what your boyfriend is really up to." She wanted to believe me when I said I hadn't sent them, but the evidence looked pretty damning. I immediately checked my phone records and found that no messages had been sent from my number to the contact shown in the screenshots. I also checked my text history and found no record of any conversations with Ashley or anyone else that matched the content of the fake messages. That's when I realised what had happened. Someone had created fake text message screenshots designed to look like they'd come from my phone. The formatting was slightly off, and some of the timestamps didn't align with my actual phone usage patterns, but they'd been crafted carefully enough to fool someone who wasn't looking for technical inconsistencies. I showed Rachel the discrepancies I'd found, and we started trying to figure out who would want to sabotage our relationship. The anonymous number that had sent the screenshots was untraceable, but the timing of the accusation, combined with Melissa's recent behaviour, made me suspicious. The next day, I set up a test. I created a fake social media profile for Ashley and started liking some of Connor's posts, making sure Melissa would see the activity. Within hours, Melissa was asking Connor about who Ashley was and why she was interacting with his social media. When Connor mentioned Ashley to me, I pretended not to know who she was, but said the name sounded familiar. I suggested maybe she was someone from work or school that I'd met briefly. Melissa immediately became very interested in this conversation and started asking detailed questions about what Ashley looked like and how I knew her. That evening, Rachel received another set of fake text screenshots, these ones showing me supposedly making plans to meet Ashley at a specific restaurant. The messages included details about Ashley's appearance that matched exactly what I'd told Melissa earlier that day. Now, I had proof that Melissa was creating the fake messages. She was the only person who had access to the specific information that appeared in the second set of screenshots, and the timing was too coincidental to be anything other than deliberate sabotage. I confronted Connor with the evidence, showing him how Melissa had used information fake messages. Connor was initially from our conversation to create more detailed defensive, saying I was being paranoid and that Melissa wouldn't do something so elaborate and malicious. But when I showed him the technical inconsistencies in the fake screenshots and explained how I'd tested Melissa's access to information, Connor started to see the pattern. He admitted that Melissa had been asking a lot of questions about Rachel lately, and that she'd seemed unusually interested in the details of my relationship. Connor confronted Melissa that night, and according to him, she broke down and admitted to creating the fake messages. She said she was convinced that Rachel was wrong for me, that she could see signs that Rachel was going to hurt me, and that she was trying to protect me from getting my heart broken. Melissa claimed she'd been planning to reveal that the messages were fake after Rachel and I broke up, thinking that it would be better for me to end a doomed relationship sooner rather than later. She said she never meant for things to go as far as they did, but that she panicked when I started investigating. Connor was horrified by what Melissa had done. He said creating fake evidence to destroy someone's relationship was completely unacceptable, regardless of her motivations. He told her she needed to apologize to both Rachel and me, and that he wasn't sure he could trust her anymore. Melissa's apology was half-hearted at best. She said she was sorry things had gotten out of hand, but maintained that she still had concerns about Rachel and that she'd been trying to look out for family. She seemed more upset about getting caught than about the damage she'd caused. Connor and Melissa broke up 2 days later. Connor said he couldn't be with someone who was capable of such elaborate manipulation and deception. He was also embarrassed that his girlfriend had tried to sabotage his brother's relationship based on nothing more than her own unfounded suspicions. Rachel and I worked through the trust issues that Melissa's fake messages had created, but it took several weeks of honest conversation and reassurance. The experience actually made our relationship stronger because we learned how to communicate through a crisis and support each other when outside forces tried to come between us. Melissa tried to contact me several times after the breakup, saying she wanted to clear the air and explain her side of the story. I blocked her on all platforms because I had no interest in hearing more justifications for her behaviour. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. Connor and I are closer than ever now, and he's been much more careful about the people he brings into our family circle. He said the experience taught him to pay attention to red flags about jealousy and controlling behaviour, even when they're directed at other people rather than himself. That story is over. Creating fake text messages to break up your boyfriend's brother is a level of manipulation that belongs in a psychological thriller. The fact that she convinced herself she was being protective while actively sabotaging innocent people shows how far some people will go to justify their destructive behaviour. Our next story comes from Riley, who discovered that family doesn't always mean security when it comes to the place you call home. My mum sold my childhood home without telling me. I came back from college to find strangers living there. I'm a junior at State University, about 4 hours away from my hometown. My mum and I have always had a complicated relationship, but I thought we'd worked through most of our issues before I left for college. She's a single parent, has been since my dad left when I was 8, and I know money has always been tight for her. Growing up, our little 2-bedroom house was everything to me. It's where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I had sleepovers with friends in middle school, where I spent countless hours in my room studying for the SATs. The house wasn't fancy, but it was ours, and it represented stability in a life that hadn't always had much of it. During my freshman and sophomore years, my mum would call me regularly with updates about home. She'd tell me about the neighbours, complain about the water heater acting up, or mention small repairs she was planning to make. Everything seemed normal, and I looked forward to coming home for breaks. Last semester, my mum started mentioning money problems more frequently. She'd lost her job at the insurance company, where she'd worked for 10 years, and finding new employment in our small town was proving difficult. She was behind on some bills and stressed about making ends meet. I offered to get a part-time job and send her what I could, but she insisted that my education came first and that she'd figure something out. She said she was looking into refinancing the house to lower her mortgage payments and that things would work out fine. During spring break, I noticed my mum seemed anxious and distracted, but when I asked about it, she said she was just dealing with job applications and interviews. The house looked the same as always, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. When I called her a few weeks ago to confirm my plans for summer break, she was oddly vague about my homecoming. She said she might be travelling for work and that we should play it by ear regarding when I'd come home. This was weird because she'd never been uncertain about my visits before. I decided to surprise her by coming home a week early, thinking it would be nice to spend extra time together and maybe help out around the house. I drove the 4 hours on a Friday afternoon, excited to sleep in my own bed and catch up with my mum. When I pulled into our driveway, there was a different car parked where my mum's usually sat. The front yard had been landscaped with plants I'd never seen before, and there were new shutters on the windows. I figured my mum had finally done some of the home improvements she'd been talking about. I used my key to open the front door and immediately knew something was wrong. The furniture was different. The walls were painted colours we'd never chosen. Family photos that had hung in the hallway for years were gone, replaced with pictures of people I didn't recognise. I stood in the living room, completely confused, when a woman came around the corner from the kitchen. She was probably in her 40s, wearing a bathrobe, and she looked as surprised to see me as I was to see her. "Excuse me," she said, "but how did you get in here?" I explained that this was my house, that I lived here with my mum, and that I had a key because this was my home. The woman looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Honey," she said gently, "I think there's been some mistake. My husband and I bought this house 3 months ago. We have the deed and everything. Are you sure you have the right address?" I pulled out my phone and showed her pictures of me in this exact living room, in my bedroom upstairs, sitting at our kitchen table. I showed her my driver's license with this address on it. I explained that I'd been living here for 10 years before leaving for college. The woman called her husband, who came downstairs and confirmed that they'd purchased the house from a woman named Linda, which is my mum's name. They showed me the closing documents, the deed transfer, and receipts for the improvements they'd made to the property. According to their paperwork, my mum had sold the house 3 months ago for significantly below market value, citing a need for a quick sale due to financial hardship. The new owners had been told the house was being sold empty, with no mention of a college-age daughter who considered it her home. I called my mum immediately, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been expecting my call. When I asked her to explain why strangers were living in our house, she broke down crying. She explained that she'd been facing foreclosure after months of missed mortgage payments. The bank was going to take the house anyway, and she'd found a buyer willing to purchase it quickly for cash. She said she'd been planning to tell me, but she didn't know how to explain that she'd lost our family home. "Where am I supposed to live?" I asked her. "Where are you living now?" My mum said she'd moved in with her sister 2 towns over, sleeping on a couch in a 1-bedroom apartment. She said there wasn't room for me there, and she'd been hoping I could find somewhere else to spend the summer, maybe with friends or by taking summer classes and staying in the dorms. I asked her why she hadn't told me about the financial problems before they got so serious, why she hadn't let me help, why she'd let me believe I had a home to come back to when I didn't. She said she was ashamed of losing the house, that she didn't want me to worry about money when I should be focusing on school, and that she'd hoped to figure out a solution before I found out about the sale. The new owners were incredibly kind about the situation. They let me go upstairs to what used to be my bedroom to process what was happening. All my childhood belongings were gone. My bed, my desk, my books, my clothes that I'd left behind, everything had been removed. When I asked my mum what had happened to my stuff, she said she'd donated most of it to charity because she didn't have anywhere to store it. She'd kept a few important things in a storage unit, but the majority of my possessions had been given away without my knowledge or consent. I spent that night in a hotel, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't afford to stay in hotels all summer. I didn't have anywhere else to live, and all my summer plans had been built around being home with my mum. The next morning, my mum came to the hotel to talk in person. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in weeks. She apologised repeatedly and said she knew she'd handled everything wrong, but that she'd been overwhelmed and scared. She explained that after losing her job, she'd quickly fallen behind on mortgage payments. She'd been too proud to ask for help and too ashamed to admit to me that she was failing financially. By the time she realised how serious the situation was, she had very few options left. The house sale had given her enough money to pay off her debts and start over, but it had also left her homeless and destroyed the stability I'd counted on. She said she'd been planning to find a new place where I could visit, but that everything had happened so fast. I was angry, hurt, and completely lost. The place I'd called home for most of my life was gone, and I'd had no say in the decision. My childhood belongings had been discarded like they were worthless, and my mum had made life-changing choices that affected me without including me in the conversation. We spent hours talking about what went wrong and what we could do moving forward. My mum admitted that she should have been honest with me from the beginning, that she should have let me help her explore other options, and that selling the house without telling me was a betrayal of my trust. I ended up spending the summer working at a camp in another state, which provided housing and gave me time to think about everything that had happened. My mum and I talked regularly, and she started seeing a financial counsellor to help her get back on track. The hardest part wasn't losing the house itself, but losing the sense of security that came with having a home base. I'd assumed that no matter what happened in my life, I could always come back to my childhood bedroom, that there would always be a place where I belonged unconditionally. My mum and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship, but it's taken months to work through the trust issues that her secrecy created. She's found a job and is renting a small apartment where I can visit, but it's not home in the way our house was. I understand that she was in an impossible financial situation and that she was trying to protect me from worry. But losing my home without any warning or discussion felt like losing a piece of my identity, and I'm still working through the emotions that came with that loss. That story is over. Coming home from college to find strangers living in your childhood bedroom because your mum secretly sold the house is the kind of shock that changes everything. The combination of financial desperation and misguided protection created a situation where nobody won, and trust got shattered along with any sense of home. Moving to our next story from Chloe, who learned that some people will use their biggest life moments as weapons against others. My best friend's wedding was a setup. She secretly planned it to humiliate her ex, who was the groom. I've been best friends with Amanda since high school, and when she asked me to be her maid of honour last year, I was thrilled. Amanda had always been dramatic, but her engagement to Michael seemed to mellow her out. She talked constantly about how much she loved him and how perfect their relationship was. Amanda and Michael had dated on and off throughout college, but they'd been broken up for almost 2 years when they suddenly got back together last spring. Their reunion seemed sudden to me, but Amanda said they'd both grown as people and were ready to make things work this time. The wedding planning process was intense. Amanda wanted everything to be perfect, and she had very specific ideas about every detail. She insisted on a large guest list, an expensive venue, and elaborate decorations that seemed designed more for social media than for actual enjoyment. What struck me as odd was how involved Amanda was in planning Michael's side of the wedding. She insisted on approving his groomsmen, helped choose his bachelor party activities, and even had opinions about what his family should wear. Michael seemed overwhelmed by all the planning but went along with Amanda's wishes. About 2 months before the wedding, Amanda started making strange comments about the ceremony. She'd say things like, "Michael's going to be so surprised," or "This wedding will definitely be memorable." When I asked what she meant, she'd just smile mysteriously and change the subject. Amanda also became obsessed with making sure certain people would attend the wedding. She spent weeks tracking down old college friends and even reached out to people Michael hadn't spoken to in years. She said she wanted everyone who knew them as a couple to be there for their big day. The week before the wedding, Amanda was practically vibrating with excitement. She kept checking her phone and making last-minute calls. She seemed more to vendors energized than nervous, which I thought was unusual bride for so close to her wedding day. The day of the ceremony, Amanda was surprisingly calm while getting ready. She kept looking at her watch and asking about the timing of different parts of the wedding. She seemed more focused on the schedule than on her appearance or the significance of what she was about to do. The wedding ceremony started normally enough. The venue looked beautiful, the guests were seated, and the music began playing on cue. I walked down the aisle as maid of honor, followed by Amanda, who looked stunning but had a strange expression. I couldn't quite read. Michael was waiting at the altar with his groomsmen, looking handsome but nervous. He kept fidgeting with his tie and glancing around at the crowd of guests. I could see sweat on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the church. The officiant began the ceremony with the standard opening remarks about love and commitment. Everything seemed normal until we got to the part where Amanda and Michael were supposed to exchange personal vows they'd written for each other. Amanda stepped forward with a folded piece of paper and began to speak, but instead of declaring her love for Michael, she started reading what sounded like a list of grievances and accusations. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent church. "2 years ago, you broke up with me via text message while I was visiting my dying grandmother. You said you'd found someone else and that our relationship had been a mistake from the beginning." The church went completely quiet. Michael's face went pale and he started shaking his head like he didn't understand what was happening. The officiant looked confused and glanced between Amanda and Michael uncertainly. Amanda continued reading from her paper. "You told mutual friends that I was clingy and desperate, that you'd only stayed with me for so long because you felt sorry for me. You made jokes about my appearance and my family's financial situation." By this point, guests were murmuring and shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Michael tried to interrupt Amanda, but she held up her hand and kept talking. "You moved in with the girl you left me for within a week of our breakup. When I tried to get closure by asking for an explanation, you blocked me on all social media and told people I was stalking you." The realization of what was happening started to dawn on everyone in the church. This wasn't a wedding ceremony anymore. This was a public confrontation designed to humiliate Michael in front of everyone he knew. Amanda folded her paper and looked directly at Michael. "So no, I don't take you to be my husband. This entire engagement has been about getting you to this moment, in front of all these people, so you could experience the humiliation you put me through." Michael stood there in shock, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. His groomsmen looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. His family members were staring in horror at the scene unfolding at the altar. Amanda turned to face the assembled guests and announced that there would be no reception, but that everyone was welcome to stay and discuss what they'd just witnessed. Then she gathered up her dress and walked out of the church, leaving Michael standing alone at the altar. The aftermath was chaos. Guests didn't know whether to leave, stay, or try to comfort Michael. His family was mortified and angry. The photographers looked confused about whether they should keep taking pictures of the disaster unfolding. I followed Amanda outside, where she was already getting into a car that had been waiting for her. When I asked her what she'd just done, she seemed exhilarated rather than upset. "I've been planning this for months," she told me. "Getting back together with him, agreeing to marry him, making him think I'd forgiven him for how he treated me. But I wanted him to feel what it's like to be humiliated in front of everyone who matters to him." Or I asked her if she realised what she'd just done to Michael, to his family, to all the guests who'd travelled for what they thought was a wedding. Amanda said she didn't care about collateral damage because Michael deserved to be exposed for who he really was. She drove away, leaving me to deal with the aftermath of her elaborate revenge plot. Michael was sitting in the front pew of the church, his head in his hands, while his family tried to figure out what to do next. The vendors still needed to be paid, guests were asking questions I couldn't answer, and I was supposed to be the maid of honor at a wedding that had never actually happened. I felt complicit in Amanda's scheme, even though I'd had no idea what she was planning. Over the next few days, the story spread through social media and our extended social circle. Some people thought Amanda's revenge was justified based on how Michael had treated her. Others were horrified by the elaborate deception and public humiliation she'd orchestrated. Michael tried to reach out to me to ask if I'd known about Amanda's plan. I honestly told him that I'd had no idea, that I'd thought Amanda was genuinely excited to marry him. He seemed broken by the experience and said he was considering moving to another city to escape the embarrassment. Amanda contacted me a week later, acting like we were still best friends and expecting me to celebrate her successful revenge with her. When I told her I was disturbed by what she'd done, she accused me of taking Michael's side and not supporting her. I ended my friendship with Amanda after that conversation, while I understood that Michael had hurt her badly during their previous breakup. Orchestrating an elaborate fake wedding to publicly humiliate him crossed every line of decency I could imagine. The whole experience made me question how well I'd ever known Amanda. The level of planning, deception, and calculated cruelty required to pull off her revenge scheme revealed a side of her personality that genuinely scared me. Michael eventually moved to another state for a fresh start. Amanda continued posting on social media about how empowered she felt by confronting her ex, but most of our mutual friends distanced themselves from her after learning what she'd done. Looking back, I realized there were warning signs about Amanda's capacity for manipulation and revenge, but I dismissed them as harmless drama. The fake wedding taught me to pay attention when someone shows you who they really are, especially when they're talking about getting even with people who've wronged them. That story is over. Using an entire wedding ceremony as an elaborate revenge plot is next-level psychological warfare. The amount of time, money, and emotional manipulation required to pull that off shows a commitment to cruelty that's genuinely frightening. Some breakups really do break people's minds. Our next story comes from Jack, who discovered that family businesses sometimes come with strings attached that feel more like chains. My dad tried to force me into his business. When I said no, he cut me off financially. I'm 22 years old and just graduated from college with a degree in environmental science. My dad owns a successful construction company that he built from nothing over the past 25 years, and he's always assumed I'd join the family business after graduation. Growing up, my dad would take me to job sites on weekends and during school breaks. I'd watch the crews work and listen to him explain different aspects of construction management. He'd talk about how someday the company would be mine, how he was building it for our family's future. The problem is, I've never been interested in construction. I'm passionate about environmental conservation and renewable energy. I want to work on projects that help combat climate change, not contribute to urban sprawl and habitat destruction. During college, I tried to have conversations with my dad about my career goals, but he'd always dismiss them as a phase. He'd say that environmental work doesn't pay well, that I'd eventually realise the value of having an established family business to fall back on. My dad paid for my college tuition, which I was grateful for, but he'd often remind me that he was investing in my education so I'd be better equipped to run his company. He'd talk about how my degree would help me understand environmental regulations that affected construction projects. Last month, a week after graduation, my dad sat me down for what he called the conversation about my future. He had paperwork ready to officially bring me into the company as a junior partner with a starting salary that was honestly pretty impressive for someone just out of college. When I told him I appreciated the offer but wanted to pursue environmental work instead, he initially laughed like I was joking. When he realised I was serious, his mood changed completely. "Everything I've built has been for you," he said. "This company is your inheritance, your security, your future. You can't just throw that away to chase some idealistic career that won't pay your bills." I tried to explain that I understood he'd worked hard to build the business, but that I had different interests and wanted to make my own way in the world. I told him I'd always be grateful for the opportunities he'd given me, but that I needed to follow my own path. My dad said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that I was rejecting everything he'd sacrificed to provide for me. He couldn't understand why I'd choose an uncertain career in environmental work over the guaranteed success of joining his established company. The conversation escalated into an argument when I mentioned that some construction practices weren't environmentally sustainable and that I had ethical concerns about certain types of development projects. My dad took this as a personal attack on his life's work. "Fine," he said finally. "If you don't want to be part of this family's success, then you can figure out how to survive without this family's support." I thought he was just angry and would cool off after a few days, but the next week, when I tried to use my credit card, it was declined. When I called to ask about it, I found out my dad had been the primary account holder and had cancelled all my cards. My dad had also been paying for my car insurance, my phone plan, and the rent on my apartment near campus. Within 2 weeks of our argument, all of these services had been cancelled without warning. When I called him to ask what was happening, he said he'd been financially supporting me with the understanding that I'd be joining the family business. Since I'd rejected that path, he saw no reason to continue paying for my lifestyle. "You want to be independent and make your own choices," he said. "Then you can learn what independence actually costs." Meant I was suddenly facing the reality of being completely financially cut off, with no warning and no time to prepare. I had some savings from summer jobs, but not nearly enough to cover rent, food, transportation, and all the other expenses my dad had been handling. I tried to reason with him, explaining that I wasn't rejecting him personally, just choosing a different career path. I offered to work part-time for his company while pursuing environmental work, or to pay him back for college expenses once I was established in my career. My dad said the only acceptable solution was for me to come work for him full-time as originally planned. He said he'd restore my financial support the moment I agreed to join the company, but not before. I reached out to other family members for help, but most of them sided with my dad. They said he'd worked hard to build something for me, and that I was being foolish to reject such a generous offer. My mum was sympathetic, but said she couldn't go against my dad's wishes. The financial pressure was intense. I had to move out of my apartment and crash on friends' couches while I looked for work. I took a part-time job at a coffee shop just to have some income, while applying for entry-level positions in environmental organisations. My dad would call occasionally to check if I was ready to come to my senses and accept his job offer. He'd point out how much I was struggling financially and remind me that all of my problems could be solved by joining his company. The manipulation was obvious but effective. I was stressed, exhausted, and starting to doubt whether I could actually support myself in my chosen field. My dad's offer began to look more appealing as my savings dwindled and my job search dragged on. 3 months after he'd cut me off, I finally got an interview with a renewable energy non-profit. It was exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing, but the starting salary was less than half of what my dad had offered me. When I told my dad about the job opportunity, he scoffed and said I was choosing poverty over prosperity. He said I could work for a non-profit as a hobby once I'd established myself financially through his company. I took the non-profit job anyway. The work was challenging and meaningful, and I felt like I was finally doing something that aligned with my values. But the financial strain was real, and I had to live very modestly to make ends meet. My dad continued to express disappointment in my choices, but he stopped trying to actively convince me to join his company. Instead, he'd make passive-aggressive comments about my lifestyle whenever we talked, comparing my small apartment and used car to what I could have had. 6 months into my new job, I got a promotion and a raise that made my financial situation more manageable. I was building experience in my field and making connections with people who shared my environmental interests. My dad eventually started speaking to me normally again, though he still makes occasional comments about my wasted potential and how I'm too smart to be working for peanuts. He's never acknowledged that cutting off my financial support was manipulation designed to force me into his business. Our relationship is still strained, but I'm glad I didn't cave to his financial pressure. Working in environmental conservation feels right in a way that construction management never would have, even if the paycheck is smaller. I've learned that family support sometimes comes with expectations that feel more like obligations. My dad genuinely believed he was offering me a gift, but he couldn't understand that freedom to choose my own path was more valuable to me than financial security in a career I didn't want. The experience taught me to be financially independent and to make career decisions based on my own values rather than external pressure. I'm building a life that feels authentic to who I am, even if it's not the life my dad envisioned for me. That story is over. Financial manipulation, disguised as tough love, is one of the cruelest forms of control parents can use on their adult children. The fact that he couldn't see the difference between supporting his son and buying his compliance shows how some people confuse love with ownership. Let's move to our next story from Lacey, who learned that some neighbours think borrowing extends to life-saving medication. My neighbour stole my dog's medication. She said it was just vitamins and gave them to her own dog. I have a 7-year-old golden retriever named Charlie who was diagnosed with a heart condition last year. It's manageable with medication, but the pills he needs are expensive and require a prescription from our veterinarian. Charlie has to take them twice daily, and missing doses can be dangerous for his health. My neighbour Patricia lives in the house next to mine, and we've always had a friendly relationship. She has an older beagle named Rufus, who she absolutely adores. Patricia and I often chat over the fence about our dogs and share recommendations for pet products and services. 3 weeks ago, I had to go out of town for a work conference. I arranged for my friend Lisa to house sit and take care of Charlie while I was gone. I left detailed instructions about Charlie's medication schedule and showed Lisa exactly how to administer his pills. I also left extra medication in case of emergencies, since Charlie's prescription can't be refilled early, and I didn't want to risk running out while I was away. The pills come in a clearly labelled prescription bottle with Charlie's name. My name. The pills come in a clearly labelled prescription bottle with Charlie's name. My name as the owner, dosage instructions, and warnings about the medication being prescribed specifically for him. When I returned from my trip, Lisa mentioned that she'd had trouble finding Charlie's medication on the last day. She said she'd looked everywhere, but couldn't locate the bottle, so she'd skipped his evening dose and was planning to give it to him as soon as I got back. I was concerned about Charlie missing his medication, so I immediately went to look for the prescription bottle. After searching the entire house, I couldn't find it anywhere. The bottle had contained about 10 days' worth of pills when I left, and now it was completely missing. I called my vet to explain the situation and ask about getting an emergency refill. The receptionist said they'd need to contact my insurance company for approval since it hadn't been long enough since the last prescription was filled. She warned me that the process could take several days. Meanwhile, Charlie needed his medication immediately. Missing doses of his heart medication could lead to serious complications, and I was getting increasingly worried about his health. I decided to ask Lisa if she remembered anything else about when the medication had gone missing. Lisa said she distinctly remembered seeing the bottle on my kitchen counter the night before I returned, but when she went to give Charlie his morning dose, it was gone. She'd assumed maybe I'd moved it before leaving, but admitted that didn't make much sense. That afternoon I was in my backyard with Charlie when I noticed Patricia in her yard giving Rufus what looks like medication. Since we'd always been open about our dog's health issues, I asked her how Rufus was doing and whether he was on any new treatments. Patricia seemed nervous when I brought up the topic. She said Rufus had been having some energy issues lately, and that she'd started giving him some vitamins to help with his overall health. When I asked where she'd gotten the vitamins, she was vague about the details. Something about her behaviour struck me as odd, so I asked if I could see what vitamins she was giving Rufus. Patricia hesitated, then went inside and came back with a prescription bottle that made my blood run cold. It was Charlie's heart medication. My name was still on the label, along with Charlie's name, and all the prescription information. Patricia had been giving my dog's life-saving heart medication to her healthy beagle as vitamins. When I confronted her about taking Charlie's medication, Patricia initially denied it. She said the bottle must have gotten mixed up somehow, that maybe Lisa had accidentally left it in her yard when she was taking care of Charlie. I pointed out that the medication was in a prescription bottle with my name and Charlie's information clearly printed on it, and that there was no way it could have accidentally ended up in her possession. Patricia finally admitted she'd taken it, but insisted she thought it was just vitamins. I saw Lisa giving Charlie pills from that bottle, she said, and I figured they were just supplements to keep him healthy. Rufus has been sluggish lately, so I thought the same vitamins might help him too. I explained that these weren't vitamins, they were prescription heart medication that could be dangerous for a dog who didn't need them. I also pointed out that taking someone else's prescription medication was theft, regardless of what she thought it was. Patricia got defensive and said she was just trying to help her dog, that she didn't realize the medication was specifically prescribed for Charlie's condition. She said if I'd labeled it more clearly as prescription only, she wouldn't have taken it. The bottle was clearly labeled as prescription medication, with multiple warnings, but Patricia seemed to think that because it came from a pet rather than a human pharmacy, the rules were different. She didn't understand why I was so upset about sharing dog vitamins between neighbours. I demanded that Patricia return what was left of Charlie's medication immediately. She went inside and came back with the bottle, which now contained only 3 pills out of the original 10. She'd been giving Rufus Charlie's heart medication for over a week. I called my vet right away to explain that another dog had been given Charlie's medication by mistake. The vet was concerned about both dogs, Charlie because he'd missed several doses, and Rufus because he'd been taking medication he didn't need. The vet advised me to bring both dogs in for examination. Charlie needed blood work to make sure missing his medication hadn't caused any cardiac issues, and Rufus needed to be checked for any adverse reactions to taking heart medication unnecessarily. Patricia reluctantly agreed to bring Rufus to the vet, but she was clearly annoyed about the expense and kept insisting that her dog seemed fine. She didn't seem to understand that just because Rufus appeared healthy didn't mean the medication hadn't affected him. The vet bills for both dogs' emergency examinations came to almost $400. Charlie's tests showed some irregularities that required adjusting his medication dosage, and Rufus had elevated heart rate that needed to be monitored for several days. When I asked Patricia to help cover the veterinary costs, since her actions had caused the emergency, she refused. She said she'd been trying to help her dog, and that accidents happen. She didn't think she should be financially responsible for what she called a misunderstanding. I was furious. Patricia's theft of Charlie's medication had put both dogs at risk, cost me hundreds of dollars in vet bills, and caused unnecessary stress and health complications for both animals. Her refusal to take responsibility made the situation even worse. I contacted my homeowner's insurance to see if they'd cover the veterinary expenses, but they said the situation didn't fall under covered incidents. I also called the police to file a report about the theft, but they said it would be difficult to prosecute since Patricia claimed she thought the medication was vitamins. The incident completely destroyed my relationship with Patricia. She started avoiding me and would rush inside whenever she saw me in the yard. When we did encounter each other, she'd make passive-aggressive comments about people who overreact to innocent mistakes. I had to install security cameras in my yard and never leave Charlie's medication anywhere Patricia might have access to it. The trust between neighbours that had existed for years was completely shattered by her decision to steal medication for her own pet. Charlie recovered fully from missing his doses, and Rufus had no lasting effects from taking the heart medication. But the whole experience taught me that some people think borrowing extends to prescription medications, and that good intentions don't excuse dangerous behaviour. I still can't believe someone would take clearly labelled prescription medication and give it to their own pet without understanding what it was or asking permission first. The casual way Patricia dismissed the seriousness of her actions showed a complete lack of responsibility and respect for both our pet's health. That story's over. Stealing your neighbour's dog's heart medication and calling it vitamins is the kind of dangerous ignorance that could have killed both animals. The fact that she refused to pay for the emergency vet bills after nearly poisoning 2 dogs shows some people will never accept responsibility for their reckless behaviour. Moving on to our next story from Megan, who discovered that some people think breaking up doesn't apply to major life events. My ex invited himself to my baby shower. He showed up drunk and tried to claim the baby. I dated Trevor for about 8 months last year, and the relationship ended badly when I found out he'd been cheating on me with multiple women. The breakup was messy, with lots of arguing and him refusing to accept that things were over between us. About 2 months after we broke up, I started dating my current boyfriend Marcus. Marcus and I connected immediately, and our relationship moved pretty quickly. We were both ready for something serious, and everything felt right between us from the beginning. 5 months into dating Marcus, I found out I was pregnant. We were both surprised but excited about starting a family together. Marcus has been incredibly supportive throughout the pregnancy, coming to every doctor's appointment and helping me prepare for the baby's arrival. I'm now 7 months pregnant, and my sister organised a baby shower for last weekend. We sent invitations to family and close friends, keeping the guest list relatively small since we wanted an intimate celebration rather than a huge party. I hadn't spoken to Trevor since our breakup 8 months ago. We have no mutual friends, no reason to stay in contact, and I'd blocked him on all social media platforms. As far as I knew, he had no knowledge of my pregnancy or relationship with Marcus. The baby shower was held at my sister's house, and everything was going perfectly. We were playing games, opening gifts, and everyone was having a great time celebrating the upcoming arrival of my daughter. Marcus was being the perfect supportive partner, helping serve food and making sure all the guests felt welcome. About halfway through the party, I heard a commotion near the front door. My sister came over to me looking concerned and said someone was at the door asking for me. When I went to see who it was, I was shocked to find Trevor standing on the porch. He was clearly intoxicated, swaying slightly and speaking too loudly. His clothes were wrinkled like he'd been drinking for hours, and he had that aggressive demeanour he'd get when he'd been consuming alcohol during our relationship. "Surprise," he said with a sloppy grin. "Heard there was a party for my baby and figured I should be here." I was completely stunned. I asked him how he'd found out about the baby shower and why he thought he should be there. Trevor said he'd run into someone who knew me and had heard about my pregnancy. He'd somehow gotten my sister's address and decided to crash the celebration. "This is my baby too," he slurred. "Don't I get a say in celebrating my own kid?" I told him firmly that this wasn't his baby, that I was pregnant with Marcus's child, and that he needed to leave immediately. Trevor laughed like I'd told a joke and said he wasn't going anywhere until he got to celebrate becoming a father. Marcus came over to see what was happening and immediately positioned himself between Trevor and me. He calmly but firmly told Trevor that he wasn't welcome at our baby shower and needed to leave the property. Trevor became belligerent and started shouting about his rights as the baby's father. He insisted that the timeline of my pregnancy meant he had to be the biological father, and that Marcus was just some guy I was using to raise his child. The math was completely wrong, and anyone who understood basic biology would know Trevor couldn't possibly be the father. But he was too drunk and delusional to listen to reason or accept the reality of the situation. My sister called the police while Marcus and I tried to de-escalate the situation. The other party guests were shocked and uncomfortable, with some of them gathering their purses and moving toward the back of the house to get away from the confrontation. Trevor kept getting louder and more aggressive, demanding that everyone at the party acknowledge him as the baby's father. He said I was lying about the paternity to hurt him, and that he wouldn't let me keep his child away from him. When I tried to explain again that he wasn't the father, Trevor accused me of cheating during our relationship and getting pregnant by someone else. He said the baby had to be his because I couldn't have moved on so quickly after our amazing relationship ended. The delusion was staggering. Trevor seemed to have rewritten history in his mind, convinced that our toxic relationship had been wonderful and that I must still be in love with him. He couldn't accept that I'd found happiness with someone else and was building a family that didn't include him. Marcus remained calm throughout the whole ordeal, but I could see he was getting angry at Trevor's behaviour and accusations. He kept his focus on protecting me and making sure I didn't get too stressed by the confrontation. When the police arrived, Trevor initially tried to charm them, explaining that he was just trying to attend his baby's shower and couldn't understand why everyone was being hostile toward him. He presented himself as the reasonable one in the situation. The officers quickly realised Trevor was intoxicated and became more serious about the situation. They asked him to provide proof that he was the baby's father, which of course he couldn't do because he wasn't. I explained to the police that Trevor was my ex-boyfriend from almost a year ago, that I was pregnant with my current boyfriend's baby, and that Trevor had shown up uninvited and was causing a disturbance at my family celebration. The officers asked Trevor to leave peacefully, but he refused, insisting that he had a right to be at his child's baby shower. His continued refusal to accept reality and leave voluntarily led to him being arrested for trespassing and public intoxication. As they were putting him in the police car, Trevor shouted at me that he'd be back, that he wouldn't let me keep his child away from him, and that I couldn't just pretend he didn't exist. The whole scene was humiliating and frightening. After Trevor was taken away, we tried to salvage what was left of the baby shower, but the mood had been completely ruined by his appearance and behaviour. Several guests left early, and those who stayed were clearly shaken by what they'd witnessed. My sister was furious that Trevor had ruined the celebration she'd worked so hard to organise. Marcus was concerned about my stress levels and wanted to make sure the confrontation hadn't affected the baby. I was embarrassed that my past relationship drama had intruded on what should have been a joyful family occasion. The next day, I got a threatening text from Trevor the next day, saying he'd be filing for custody of his child and that I couldn't keep him away from what was rightfully his. When I showed the messages to Marcus, we decided to contact a lawyer to understand what legal protections we had. The lawyer explained that Trevor had no legal standing to claim paternity without proof, and that his harassment could result in a restraining order if it continued. We documented everything from the baby shower incident and his subsequent messages in case we needed evidence later. Trevor continued trying to contact me through various means over the next few weeks. He'd call from different phone numbers, create fake social media accounts to message me, and even showed up at my workplace once demanding to talk about our baby. Each incident was reported to the police, and we were eventually able to get a temporary restraining order that prohibited Trevor from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace. The legal process was stressful, but it was necessary to protect my family. My daughter was born healthy 2 months later, and Trevor's delusional claims about paternity became even more obviously false once the timeline was clear. Marcus and I are now focused on raising our child in peace, without the drama and chaos that Trevor tried to inject into our lives. The whole experience taught me that some people will create their own reality when they can't accept the truth, and that protecting your family sometimes requires legal intervention to stop harassment from unstable ex-partners. That story is over. Crashing someone's baby shower while drunk and claiming to be the father of a child that couldn't possibly be yours is pure delusion mixed with alcohol and entitlement. The fact that he got arrested at a baby shower and still thought he was in the right shows how completely disconnected from reality some people can become. Our next story comes from Leo, who learned that some teachers think student success reflects their own genius. My teacher tried to take credit for my science fair project. When I won first place, he said he built the model. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I've always been really into engineering and building things. My dad's a mechanical engineer, and he's been teaching me about design and construction since I was little. I love the problem-solving aspect of figuring out how to make something work. For our school's annual science fair, I wanted to do something that would really showcase what I'd learned about engineering principles. I decided to build a working model of a suspension bridge that could support different weight loads while demonstrating the physics behind cable-stayed structures. I spent about 3 months planning and building the project. I researched different bridge designs, calculated load distributions, and even visited a local bridge construction site to understand real-world applications. The math and physics involved were pretty complex for a high school project. My physics teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, seemed interested in what I was working on. He'd stop by during study hall when I was working on calculations and ask questions about my design process. I thought he was just being supportive and trying to help me succeed. As the science fair approached, Mr. Rodriguez started giving me more and more suggestions about my project. He'd recommend changes to my design that I'd already considered and rejected, or point out potential problems that I'd already solved in my planning phase. The week before the science fair, I brought my completed model to school to make some final adjustments. The bridge was about 3 feet long, made from carefully measured wooden components and steel cables with a working mechanism to test different load weights. Mr. Rodriguez spent a lot of time examining my project that week. He'd come by during lunch and after school, asking detailed questions about how I'd constructed different components and what materials I'd used. I was happy to explain my work since I was proud of what I'd accomplished. The day of the science fair, I set up my display with my research documentation, photos of the construction process, and the working bridge model. I'd also prepared a presentation explaining the engineering principles and physics calculations behind the design. The judges were impressed with my project. They asked thoughtful questions about load distribution, material selection, and the mathematical models I'd used to predict the bridge's performance. I felt confident about my explanations and demonstration. When they announced the winners later that day, I was thrilled to learn that my bridge project had won first place in the engineering category. It was the biggest academic achievement of my high school career so far, and I couldn't wait to tell my parents. But my excitement was immediately dampened when Mr. Rodriguez approached me after the announcement. Instead of congratulating me, he started talking to the other teachers and parents nearby about our project and how we had worked together to create the winning design. "I'm really proud of the work we did on this bridge," he told a group of parents. "It took months of collaboration between Leo and me to get the engineering right. I helped him with all the complex calculations and guided him through the construction process." I was stunned. While Mr. Rodriguez had asked questions and made some suggestions, he hadn't actually contributed to any of the design, calculations, or construction. I'd done all the research, planning, and building entirely on my own time, using my own materials and tools. When I tried to politely correct him by mentioning that I'd done the project independently, Mr. Rodriguez gave me a look that clearly said I should stay quiet. He continued talking to the adults about his mentorship of my project and how teachers play such important roles in student success. After the crowd dispersed, Mr. Rodriguez pulled me aside and said he hoped I understood that teachers deserve recognition when their students achieve great things. He said my success reflected his excellent teaching and guidance, and that acknowledging his contribution was just good manners. I told him I appreciated his interest in my project, but that I'd done all the actual work myself and deserved to be recognized for my individual achievement. Mr. Rodriguez said that was a selfish attitude and that successful students should always credit their teachers. The situation got worse when the local newspaper wanted to do a story about my science fair victory. When the reporter called to set up an interview, Mr. Rodriguez insisted on being included in the article as my project mentor and co-creator of the winning design. During the newspaper interview, Mr. Rodriguez dominated the conversation, talking about his engineering expertise, and how he'd guided me through the complex technical challenges of building a suspension bridge. He made it sound like I'd been his assistant rather than the actual designer and builder. When the reporter asked me specific questions about the construction process, Mr. Rodriguez would jump in with answers before I could speak. He'd describe techniques and decisions as if he'd made them, when in reality, I'd figured everything out through research and trial and error. The published article made it seem like Mr. Rodriguez had been heavily involved in creating the project, with me mentioned almost as an afterthought. My parents were furious when they read it, knowing how much time and effort I'd put into the bridge on my own. My dad called the school principal to complain about Mr. Rodriguez taking credit for my work. The principal said he'd look into the situation, but that it was common for teachers to be recognised alongside their successful students. When my dad explained that Mr. Rodriguez hadn't actually contributed to the project beyond asking occasional questions, the principal seemed more concerned. He said he'd speak with Mr. Rodriguez about appropriate ways to support student achievement without overstating his involvement. The conversation with the principal must have made Mr. Rodriguez defensive because he started treating me differently in class. He'd make subtle comments about students who don't appreciate their teacher's help, or assign me extra work while claiming it was to challenge me further. The whole experience taught me that some adults will try to claim credit for young people's accomplishments, especially when those accomplishments bring recognition or prestige. It was disappointing to learn that a teacher I'd respected would prioritise his own reputation over acknowledging student achievement. I ended up winning a regional science fair competition with the same bridge project, and this time I made sure to clearly communicate to judges and reporters that I designed and built it independently. Mr. Rodriguez wasn't happy about being left out of the recognition, but he couldn't dispute the documentation I had of my independent work. Looking back, I realise I should have been more assertive about protecting credit for my work from the beginning. It's important to document your contributions and speak up when someone tries to diminish your achievements, even if that person is in a position of authority. That story's over. A teacher stealing credit for a student's months of independent engineering work and then dominating the newspaper interview is academic theft at its worst. The fact that he tried to punish the kid afterward for getting the principal involved shows exactly what kind of person prior to our next story from Nikki's their ego over student success. Moving, who discovered that some parents think love can be bought and sold. My girlfriend's dad paid me to break up with her. He thought I wasn't good enough and offered $5,000. I've been dating Sophia for about a year and a half, and we're both juniors in college. We met in our economics class and have been pretty much inseparable since our first date. She's smart, funny, and we have this easy chemistry that makes everything feel natural between us. Sophia comes from a wealthy family. Her dad owns several car dealerships across the state, and they live in this massive house in the nicest part of town. I grew up in a working-class family where my mum works 2 jobs to make ends meet, so Sophia's background is pretty different from mine. From the beginning, Sophia's dad, Robert, has been polite but distant whenever I'm around. He'll make small talk about school or sports, but I can tell he's evaluating me every time we interact. He asks questions about my major, my career plans, and my family's financial situation in a way that feels more like a job interview than casual conversation. Sophia has always been aware that her dad is protective and has high expectations for anyone she dates. She's mentioned that he scared off a few of her previous boyfriends with his intensity and judgment, but she's also made it clear that she doesn't care what he thinks about her dating choices. Last month, Robert asked if I could meet him for coffee to discuss something important. I figured he wanted to talk about Sophia and me getting more serious, maybe ask about my intentions, or give me the standard father lecture about treating his daughter right. We met at this upscale coffee shop downtown, and Robert was unusually friendly and relaxed. He asked about my classes, my part-time job, and my plans after graduation. The conversation felt normal until he suddenly shifted to talking about Sophia's future. Sophia's a special girl, he said. She deserves someone who can provide for her the way she's accustomed to living. Someone who can give her the kind of life her mother and I have worked hard to create for our family. I told him I understood his concerns and that I cared deeply about Sophia's happiness and well-being. I explained that while I might not come from wealth, I was working hard in school and had solid career prospects that would allow me to support a family someday. Robert nodded like he was listening, but then he said something that completely blindsided me. I'm sure you're a nice young man, but realistically, you're not in the same league as my daughter. I think it would be better for everyone if you ended this relationship before you both get too invested. I was shocked by his directness, but I told him respectfully that Sophia and I were happy together and that our relationship wasn't based on financial status or family background. I said I understood his protective instincts, but that his daughter was old enough to make her own decisions about dating. That's when Robert pulled out his checkbook. I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 to end things with Sophia cleanly. No drama, no hurt feelings, just a mutual decision to go your separate ways. You could use the money for school expenses or whatever you need. I stared at the check he'd written out, made payable to me for $5,000. I couldn't believe he was literally trying to pay me to break up with his daughter. The whole situation felt like something out of a movie, not a real conversation I was having. You're seriously trying to bribe me to dump your daughter? I asked. Robert said he preferred to think of it as providing financial assistance to help me make a practical decision. He claimed that deep down, I knew our relationship wouldn't work long term because of our different backgrounds, and that accepting his offer would save everyone from eventual heartbreak. He also mentioned that $5,000 was probably more money than I'd ever had at one time, and that it could make a real difference in my life. He suggested I think of it as an investment in my future rather than payment for breaking up with Sophia. I pushed the check back across the table and told him I wasn't interested in his money. I said that if he had concerns about me dating his daughter, he should discuss them with Sophia directly, rather than trying to manipulate the situation behind her back. Robert seemed surprised by my refusal. He said most young men in my position would jump at the chance to improve their financial situation, and that my rejection of his offer showed I wasn't thinking practically about my future. This is a one-time opportunity, he warned me. If you refuse my offer now, don't expect another chance later, when you realize I was right about your incompatibility. I told him again that I wasn't going to break up with Sophia for money, and that his attempt to buy me off was insulting to both his daughter and me. I said I hoped someday he'd get to know me well enough to judge me on my character rather than my bank account. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Robert saying he was disappointed in my decision and that I'd regret not taking his advice. He left the check on the table as I walked away, like he thought I might change my mind and come back for it. I debated whether to tell Sophia about her father's bribery attempt. Part of me thought she deserved to know what he'd done, but another part worried that it would cause unnecessary family drama and put her in an impossible position between her father and her boyfriend. I decided to tell her because I felt like keeping it secret would be dishonest. When I explained what had happened at the coffee shop, Sophia was furious with her father. She said she was embarrassed by his behaviour and couldn't believe he'd tried to pay me to leave her. Sophia confronted Robert that same day, and according to her, he didn't deny what he'd done. He said he was looking out for her best interests and trying to prevent her from making a mistake that would limit her future opportunities. The confrontation created a lot of tension in Sophia's family. Her mother was upset that Robert had gone behind Sophia's back, and there were several heated arguments about respect, trust, and letting adult children make their own decisions. Robert eventually apologized to both Sophia and me, saying he'd handled the situation poorly. But his apology felt more like damage control than genuine remorse, and I could tell he still believed his concerns about our relationship were valid. The whole experience actually brought Sophia and me closer together. Going through that kind of External pressure and family drama tested our relationship in ways that showed us how much we really cared about each other. We're still together now, and Robert has been more civil toward me since the bribery incident. He's never offered me money again, but I can tell he's still not thrilled about his daughter dating someone from a different economic background. The experience taught me that some people genuinely believe that love and relationships should be based on financial compatibility rather than emotional connection. It also showed me that standing up for your principles, even when it's difficult, is always the right choice. That story is over. Imagine trying to bribe your daughter's boyfriend to break up with her and then acting shocked when he refuses to sell his relationship for $5,000. Some parents think they can solve every problem with money, including problems that exist only in their own prejudiced minds. Our next story comes from another person named Riley, who discovered that family surprises aren't always the good kind. My cousin tried to crash my birthday with my ex. They thought it'd be funny to surprise me. I turned 23 last weekend, and I'd been looking forward to celebrating with my close friends and family. I'd planned a relatively small party at my apartment, nothing too crazy, just good food, music, and the people I care most about. My cousin Brandon and I used to be really close growing up, but we've drifted apart over the past few years. He's developed this sense of humour that involves pushing boundaries and creating uncomfortable situations that he thinks are hilarious but usually just end up hurting people's feelings. About 2 months before my birthday, I went through a pretty rough breakup with my ex-boyfriend Tyler. The relationship had been toxic for months, and when it finally ended, I was relieved but also emotionally drained. Tyler had a way of making everything about himself and turning every conversation into drama. The breakup was messy because Tyler couldn't accept that things were over. He'd show up at places he knew I'd be, send long emotional texts about how we were meant to be together, and generally make it difficult for me to move on with my life. I'd made it very clear to my family and friends that I didn't want Tyler at any of my social events, and that I was trying to maintain distance from him while I healed from the relationship. Everyone seemed to understand and respect my boundaries. Brandon knew about the breakup and how difficult Tyler had been about accepting it. We'd talked about it a few times when Brandon would ask how I was doing, and I'd explained that I was much happier without the constant drama and manipulation. The day of my party, everything was going perfectly. My friends had decorated my apartment beautifully, we had amazing food, and everyone was having a great time. I felt genuinely happy and celebrated, surrounded by people who cared about me. About 2 hours into the party, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, I was shocked to see Brandon standing there with Tyler right behind him. Tyler had this awkward smile on his face, and Brandon looked like he was barely containing his excitement about whatever he thought he was doing. "Surprise!" Brandon announced loudly enough for everyone at the party to hear. "Look who I brought to help celebrate your birthday." I was completely speechless. I couldn't understand why Brandon would bring Tyler to my party when he knew about our difficult breakup and my desire to maintain distance from him. The whole thing felt like a betrayal and a violation of the boundaries I'd clearly established. Tyler started talking immediately, saying he missed me and wanted to wish me a happy birthday in person. He had a gift with him and was acting like his presence at my party was perfectly normal and welcome. I pulled Brandon aside and asked him what he was thinking, bringing Tyler to my birthday celebration. Brandon said he thought it would be funny to surprise me, and that maybe Tyler and I could work things out if we just spent some time together in a relaxed setting. "You guys were so good together," he said with a grin. "I thought maybe seeing him would remind you of all the fun times you had. Plus, Tyler really wanted to come, and it's your birthday, so I figured, why not?" I explained to Brandon that this wasn't funny or helpful, that I'd specifically said I didn't want Tyler in my life, and that bringing him to my party without asking was completely inappropriate. I asked him to take Tyler and leave immediately. Brandon acted like I was overreacting and being dramatic. He said it was just a harmless surprise, that Tyler seemed genuinely sorry about how things had ended, and that I should at least give him a chance to explain himself. Meanwhile, Tyler had made himself comfortable at my party, talking to my friends and acting like he belonged there. Some of my guests looked confused and uncomfortable, not sure how to handle the unexpected appearance of my problematic ex-boyfriend. I told Tyler directly that he wasn't welcome at my party and needed to leave. Tyler said he just wanted to give me my birthday present and have one conversation to clear the air between us. He promised he'd leave right after we talked privately. The whole situation was creating tension and awkwardness at what was supposed to be a fun celebration. My friends were looking to me for guidance on how to handle the situation, and I could feel the positive energy of the party being drained by Tyler's unwelcome presence. Brandon kept insisting that I was being unreasonable and that Tyler deserved a chance to make things right. He said he'd gone to a lot of trouble to coordinate this surprise, and that the least I could do was appreciate his effort to help fix my relationship. I had to get firm with both of them. I told Brandon that bringing Tyler to my party without permission was a violation of my trust and boundaries, and that his idea of helping was actually causing me stress on my birthday. I told Tyler that showing up uninvited after I'd made it clear I wanted space was harassment, and that using my cousin to get access to my celebration was manipulative and unacceptable. When they both continued to argue that their intentions were good, I had to ask other people at the party to help me get them to leave. It was embarrassing and frustrating to have to kick people out of my own birthday celebration. Tyler finally left, but not before making a scene about how I was being cruel and unfair to someone me well. Brandon, who just wanted to wish, left with him, saying he was disappointed in my reaction and that he'd just been trying to help. After they were gone, it took a while for the party to get back to its previous positive energy. My friends were supportive and helped me refocus on celebrating, but the unexpected drama had definitely affected the mood of the evening. The next day, Brandon texted me saying he was sorry the surprise hadn't gone over well, but that he still thought Tyler and I should work things out. He didn't seem to understand that the problem wasn't just Tyler's presence, but his decision to ambush me with an unwelcome guest at my own party. I had to explain to Brandon that good intentions don't excuse boundary violations, and that surprising someone with their problematic ex-boyfriend isn't helpful or funny. I told him that if he wanted to maintain a relationship with me, he needed to respect my decisions about who I want in my life. Brandon eventually gave me a more genuine apology, admitting that he'd made a mistake by not asking me first, but the damage to our relationship had been done, and I realised I couldn't trust him to respect my boundaries in the future. The whole experience taught me that some people think they know what's best for you better than you know yourself, and that they'll take actions based on their assumptions rather than respecting your clearly stated preferences. That story is over. Ambushing someone with their toxic ex-boyfriend at their own birthday party and calling it a surprise is friendship sabotage disguised as help. Some people really think they're Cupid when they're actually just creating chaos and violating boundaries for their own entertainment. Let's move to our next story from Cole, who learned that some landlords have creative interpretations of utility arrangements. My landlord used my power bill to charge his house. I found out when I got a $900 electric bill for a one-bedroom apartment. I moved into my current apartment about 6 months ago, after graduating college and starting my first real job. The place is a small one-bedroom unit in an older building, nothing fancy, but the rent was reasonable and the location worked well for my commute. When I signed the lease, my landlord, Derek, explained that utilities weren't included in the rent, which is pretty standard. He said I'd need to set up accounts with the electric company, internet provider, and gas company in my own name, and pay those bills directly. The first few months, my utility bills seemed normal for a small apartment. My electric bill was usually around $60 to $80 per month, which seemed reasonable for someone who works full-time and isn't lives much during the day. Derek's home in a larger house about 2 blocks away from my apartment building. He owns several rental properties in the neighbourhood and seems to do pretty well for himself. He drives an expensive car and always talks about his business, various investments when we interact. In my 4th month of living there, I noticed my electric bill had jumped to about $120. I figured maybe I'd been using the air conditioning more during a particularly, or that the hot spell rates had gone up. It was annoying but not alarming enough to investigate further. The next month my bill was almost $180, which definitely seemed high for my small apartment and minimal usage. I started paying more attention to my energy consumption, turning off lights religiously and unplugging devices when I wasn't using them. Despite my efforts to reduce usage, my 6th month's electric bill was over $250. This was getting ridiculous for someone living alone in a 500 square foot apartment. I called the electric company to ask if there might be an error in the meter reading. The customer service representative said the meter readings were accurate and suggested that I might have an appliance malfunctioning or some other issue causing unusually high energy consumption. She recommended having an electrician check my apartment. Last month I opened my electric bill and nearly fell over. The amount due was $847 for 1 month of electricity in my tiny apartment. There was absolutely no way I could have used that much power, even if I'd left every light and appliance running 24/7. I immediately called the electric company again, this time demanding a detailed explanation of the charges. The representative walked me through my usage patterns and confirmed that according to their records, my meter was showing extremely high consumption. She suggested I check with my landlord to make sure there wasn't some issue with how the electrical system was set up in my building. She said sometimes older buildings have wiring problems that can cause unusual billing situations. When I contacted Derek about the electric bill issue, he seemed genuinely surprised and concerned. He said he'd never heard of such high bills from any of his tenants and offered to have someone look at the electrical system in my apartment. Derek sent over a next day to electrician to inspect my unit. The electrician spent about an hour checking outlets, looking at the breaker box and testing various connections. He said everything in my apartment seemed normal and up to code, but then the electrician asked to see my electric meter to compare it with his readings from inside the apartment. When we went to look at the meter bank outside the building, he discovered something that explained everything. My electric meter was connected not just to my apartment, but also to Derek's house, 2 blocks away. Somehow the wiring had been set up so that Derek's entire home electrical system was running through my meter and being charged to my account. The electrician said this kind of setup doesn't happen by accident. Someone had deliberately connected Derek's house to my meter, probably to avoid having him pay for his own electricity usage. It was essentially electrical theft, but set up in a way that made me the victim, paying for someone else's power consumption. I confronted Derek immediately with what the electrician had found. Derek initially acted shocked and claimed he had no idea how his house could be connected to my meter. He said there must be some kind of mistake or crossed wiring from when the building's electrical system was updated years ago. But when I pressed him for details about when this supposed renovation had happened, his story kept changing. First he said it was before he bought the building, then he claimed it happened right after he purchased it. Then he wasn't sure exactly when the work had been done. The electrician who discovered the connection told me privately that this kind of setup required deliberate planning and installation. He said someone would have had to run specific wiring from Derek's house to my meter, which wasn't something that could happen accidentally during routine maintenance. I demanded that Derek fix the wiring immediately and reimburse me for the months of inflated electric bills I'd been paying. Derek said he'd look into it, but that these kinds of electrical issues could be complicated and expensive to resolve. When I told Derek I was prepared to contact the electric company and potentially the police about what appeared to be utility fraud, his attitude changed completely. He became defensive and started suggesting that maybe I was using more electricity than I realized. Derek said that my bill seemed high, but that he couldn't be responsible for my energy usage habits. He implied that maybe I was leaving lights on or using space heaters that I'd forgotten about. It was obviously ridiculous since I'd been monitoring my usage carefully for months. I called the electric company again and explained what the electrician had discovered. The customer service representative transferred me to their fraud investigation department, who said they'd send out their own technician to verify the meter connections. The electric company's investigator confirmed that my meter was indeed connected to an external property and that this constituted utility theft. He took photos, documented the illegal connection, and said they'd be pursuing the matter legally. Meanwhile, I contacted a tenants' rights organisation to understand my legal options. They told me that landlords illegally using tenant utility accounts was more common than people realised, and that I had strong grounds for legal action against Derek. When Derek realised that the electric company and legal authorities were getting involved, he suddenly became very motivated to resolve the situation. He had the illegal connection removed within 48 hours and offered to reimburse me for my excessive electric bills. But calculating exactly how much Derek owed me was complicated. I'd been living there for 6 months, and my bills had been gradually increasing, as he'd apparently been using more and more of his house's electrical systems on my account. Based on normal usage for similar apartments in the area, I estimated that Derek had cost me nearly $2,000 in inflated electric bills over the 6 months I'd lived there. When I presented him with this figure, he claimed it was too high and that I couldn't prove how much of my usage had been legitimate. The electric company's investigation supported my calculations. They provided data showing that my meter usage was completely inconsistent with a single-person household in a small apartment, and that the excess usage patterns matched typical residential home consumption. Derek eventually agreed to reimburse me $1,800, which was most of what he'd stolen through the illegal connection. He also agreed to pay for having a licensed electrician verify that all the wiring in my apartment was now properly connected and legal. The whole process took about 2 months to resolve completely. During that time, my electric bills dropped back to the normal $60 to $80 range, confirming that Derek's house connection had been the source of the problem. I seriously considered moving out after discovering that my landlord had been stealing from me for months, but finding a new apartment would have been expensive and time-consuming. Derek seemed genuinely concerned about avoiding legal consequences, so I decided to stay. The experience taught me to pay attention when utility bills seem unusually high, and to ask questions rather than just assuming I'm using more energy than I thought. It also showed me that some landlords will take advantage of tenants in ways I never would have imagined. Derek and I now have a much more formal relationship. I document everything in writing and don't trust him to handle any issues without oversight. The theft of my electricity payments revealed a side of his character that made me realise I needed to protect myself as a tenant. I also learned about the importance of understanding how utility connections work in rental properties. Now I make sure to verify that my meters are only connected to my unit and that I'm only paying for services I'm actually receiving. That story's over. Stealing your tenant's electricity for 6 months and then acting shocked when you get caught is landlord scumbaggery at its finest. The fact that he tried to gaslight her into thinking she was just using too much power shows exactly the kind of person who'd set up utility theft in the first place. Moving to our next story from another person whose name starts with E, who discovered that friendship and art don't always mix well. My friend tried to sell my artwork as his own. He watermarked my painting and submitted it to a contest. I've been passionate about digital art since middle school, and I've spent years developing my skills in illustration and graphic design. It's not just a hobby for me. I'm seriously considering pursuing art as a career after I finish college. My friend Ryan and I have known each other since freshman year, and he's always been supportive of my artistic interests. He'd ask to see my latest projects, give feedback on pieces I was working on, and even helped me set up social media accounts to showcase my portfolio. Ryan isn't particularly artistic himself, but he's always been interested in the business side of creative work. He'd talk about marketing strategies, ways to monetize artistic skills, and different opportunities for artists to make money through contests and commissions. About 3 months ago, I finished a digital painting that I was really proud of. It was a fantasy landscape with incredible detail that had taken me over 40 hours to complete. The piece showed a mystical forest with glowing creatures and ethereal lighting effects that I'd spent weeks perfecting. I posted the artwork on my social media accounts and sent it to several friends, including Ryan, to get their opinions. Everyone loved it, and Ryan was especially enthusiastic, saying it was the best thing I'd ever created and that I should definitely enter it in art competitions. Ryan mentioned a digital art contest he'd seen advertised online with a $5,000 first prize and potential opportunities for freelance work with the sponsoring company. He encouraged me to submit my forest painting, saying it had a real chance of winning. I looked into the contest and was interested, but the deadline was approaching quickly, and I was dealing with midterm exams at the time. I told Ryan I'd probably skip this particular competition and look for others with more convenient timing. Ryan said that was a shame because he really thought my artwork could win, and that missing the deadline would be a wasted opportunity. He offered to help me prepare the submission materials if I wanted to enter, but I said I was too busy with school to focus on contest preparations. 2 weeks after the submission deadline passed, Ryan texted me excitedly, saying he had great news about my forest painting. When I asked what he meant, he said he'd decided to submit it to the contest, on my behalf, as a surprise, and that we'd made it to the semi-final round. I was confused because I hadn't given Ryan permission to submit my artwork anywhere, and I wasn't sure how he could have entered a contest in my name without my involvement. When I asked for details, Ryan's explanation didn't make sense. It turned out that Ryan hadn't submitted the painting under my name at all. He'd entered the contest himself using my artwork, but claiming it as his own creation. He'd even added his own watermark to the piece and created a fake story about his artistic process and inspiration. When I found out what Ryan had done, I was furious and demanded that he withdraw from the contest immediately and explain to the judges that he wasn't the real artist. Ryan said that would be impossible since the judging was already in progress and he couldn't change his submission. Ryan tried to justify his actions by saying he was trying to help me get recognition for my work and that since I'd decided not to enter the contest myself, he was making sure my art didn't go to waste. He said we could split any prize money if he won. I explained to Ryan that entering someone else's artwork in a contest under his own name was plagiarism and fraud, regardless of his intentions. I told him that my decision not to enter the contest didn't give him permission to steal my work and claim credit for it. When I threatened to contact the contest organisers myself to report the plagiarism, Ryan panicked and begged me not to ruin his chances. He said he'd already told people about making it to the semi-finals and that being exposed as a fraud would be humiliating. Ryan promised that if he won any prizes, he'd give me all the money and credit after the contest was over. He said he'd explain to everyone that I was the real artist and that he'd just been helping me navigate the submission process. But I knew that was nonsense. Contest winners get public recognition, portfolio opportunities and professional connections that can't be transferred after the fact. If Ryan won using my artwork, he'd get all the career benefits, while I'd remain unknown to the judges and sponsors. I contacted the contest organisers directly and explained the situation. I provided proof that I was the original artist, including my original digital files with timestamps, progress screenshots, and documentation of my creative process. The contest organisers took the plagiarism report seriously and launched an investigation into Ryan's submission. When they compared my original files to his entry, it was obvious that Ryan had stolen my work and falsely claimed it as his own creation. Ryan was immediately disqualified from the contest and banned from entering any future competitions sponsored by that organisation. They also said they might pursue legal action against him for fraud and misrepresentation. When Ryan realised his scheme had completely backfired, he became angry with me for ruining his opportunity. He said I was being petty and vindictive, and that I should have let him win the contest since I hadn't wanted to enter it myself. The contest organisers offered to let me enter my artwork in the next round of judging since I was the legitimate artist. While I didn't win the grand prize, my painting received an honourable mention and I was invited to participate in a group exhibition. My friendship with Ryan never recovered from his betrayal. I couldn't trust someone who would steal my work and lie about it, then get angry at me for stopping him from committing fraud. The incident showed me a side of his character that I'd never seen before. The experience taught me to be more careful about sharing my artwork and to always maintain clear records of my creative process. It also showed me that some people will take advantage of your talents if they think they can get away with it. I've since been more selective about who I show my work to and always watermark my pieces before sharing them online. The arts community has been supportive, and several people reached out after hearing about the plagiarism incident to offer encouragement and advice. That story is over. Stealing your friend's 40-hour digital masterpiece, watermarking it as your own, and then getting mad when they stop you from committing contest fraud is friendship betrayal with a side of criminal stupidity. Some people really think they can just rebrand other people's talent and call it their own hustle. Our next story comes from Hannah, who came home to find that her living situation had changed without consultation. My mum's boyfriend moved in without asking. I came home from school and all his stuff was in our living room. I'm a senior in high school, and for the past 3 years it's just been my mum and me living in our 2-bedroom apartment. My parents divorced when I was 14, and while the adjustment was difficult at first, my mum and I developed a really close relationship and comfortable routine together. About 8 months ago, my mum started dating Kevin, a guy she met through her work. Kevin seemed nice enough when I first met him, though he had a tendency to dominate conversations and make everything about his opinions and experiences. At first, Kevin would just come over for dinner occasionally or take my mum out on dates. Their relationship seemed pretty casual, and my mum would ask for my thoughts about him after he'd visited. I told her I was happy she was dating, but wasn't particularly impressed with Kevin's personality. Over the past few months, Kevin started spending more time at our apartment. He'd come over after work, stay for dinner, watch television with us, and sometimes stay late into the evening. My mum seemed happy with the increased attention and companionship. Kevin would make himself very comfortable in our home, putting his feet up on our coffee table, leaving his belongings around the living room, and acting like he belonged there. He'd use our bathroom, raid our refrigerator, and even answer our landline phone when it rang. I started feeling like Kevin was gradually taking over our space without anyone asking how I felt about it. He'd change the television channel without asking what I was watching, make suggestions about how we should rearrange our furniture, and give opinions about household decisions that didn't concern him. When I mentioned to my mum that Kevin seemed to be spending an excessive amount of time at our apartment, she said she enjoyed his company and that I should be happy she'd found someone who cared about her. She said Kevin was just trying to be part of our family. Last Friday, I came home from school expecting to have the afternoon to myself to work on college applications. Instead, I opened our front door to find our living room completely rearranged and filled with furniture and belongings I'd never seen before. There was a large reclining chair where our bookshelf had been positioned directly under there, which was a large reclining chair where our bookshelf used to be. The coffee table was gone, replaced by a bigger one with different decorations. There were men's clothes hanging in our coat closet and unfamiliar shoes lined up by the front door. Kevin was in the kitchen making himself a sandwich when he saw me standing in the doorway, looking confused. "Hey, Hannah," he said casually, like this was completely normal. "Hope you don't mind I rearranged things a bit to make room for my stuff." I asked him what he meant by his stuff and why it was all in our living room. Kevin explained that he'd moved in that morning while I was at school and that my mum had said it was okay. He acted like this was something we'd all discussed and agreed upon. When I told him I'd never heard anything about him moving in, Kevin seemed surprised. He said my mum had mentioned it to him weeks ago and that he'd assumed she'd talked to me about it too. He suggested maybe there had been a miscommunication. My mum came home from work about an hour later to find me sitting in my bedroom, upset and confused about Kevin's sudden presence in our home. When I asked her about his claim that she'd agreed to let him move in, she looked guilty and defensive. She admitted that she and Kevin had been discussing him moving in for a few weeks, but that she'd been waiting for the right time to talk to me about it. She said Kevin's lease was ending and that it made financial sense for him to move in with us. I pointed out that this was a decision that affected me too, and that I should have been included in the conversation before Kevin actually moved his belongings into our shared living space. My mum said she knew I'd been stressed about college applications and didn't want to add more pressure. But I felt like my opinion and comfort in my own home had been completely disregarded. Kevin had essentially moved in without my knowledge or consent, and now I was expected to just accept the new living arrangement because it was convenient for them. The next few days were incredibly awkward. Kevin was trying to act like everything was normal, making conversation about my school day and offering to help with household chores. But I felt like a stranger in my own home, with this man I barely knew occupying our common areas. Kevin had brought a lot of furniture and belongings that didn't fit well in our small apartment. Our living room felt cramped and unfamiliar, filled with his oversized chair, sports memorabilia, and electronics that dominated the space where my mum and I used to spend time together. My mum kept trying to convince me that having Kevin live with us would be good for our family. She said we'd save money on rent and utilities, that Kevin could help with household repairs, and that I'd get used to having him around once I gave him a chance. But the issue wasn't whether Kevin was a good person or whether he could contribute to the household. The issue was that major decisions about our home and family were being made without including me in the conversation. Despite the fact that I lived there too, I felt like my mum had chosen Kevin's comfort and convenience over my feelings and input. She'd allowed him to move in and rearrange our entire living space without considering how I might feel about sharing my home with someone I hadn't agreed to live with. The situation created tension between my mum and me that hadn't existed before Kevin's arrival. We'd always made decisions together and respected each other's opinions about our shared space. Now I felt like my voice didn't matter when it came to who could live in our home. 3 weeks after Kevin moved in, I had a serious conversation with my mum about feeling displaced in my own home. I explained that while I wanted her to be happy, I also needed to feel comfortable and heard when it came to decisions that affected our living situation. My mum apologised for not discussing Kevin's move with me beforehand, but said that since he was already settled in, it would be difficult to change the arrangement. She asked me to try living with the situation until I graduated and left for college. I realised that my mum had prioritised her relationship with Kevin over our established family dynamic, and that my comfort in our home was being treated as less important than his convenience. It was a painful lesson about how romantic relationships can sometimes override family considerations. Kevin and I eventually developed a polite but distant relationship. He tried to be respectful of my space and schedule, but the fact remained that he'd moved into my home without my input, and that fundamental lack of consideration coloured all our interactions. The experience taught me that major household decisions should involve everyone who lives there, regardless of age or relationship status. It also showed me that sometimes parents make choices based on their own needs, without fully considering how those choices affect their children. That story is over. Coming home to find your living room completely rearranged because some guy decided to move in without asking is like being invaded by the world's most inconsiderate house guest. The fact that her mum thought stress about college applications was a good excuse for making major life decisions behind her back shows some seriously backwards priorities. Moving to our next story from Dylan, who discovered that family members sometimes have creative approaches to fake a kidnapping for money. She wanted to fundraising. My sister tried to scam our parents for ransom cash. I'm 25 and my sister Amber is 22. We've always had a complicated relationship because she's been getting into trouble since she was a teenager. She's impulsive, dramatic, and has a history of making poor decisions that somehow always end up affecting the whole family. Amber dropped out of college last year and has been struggling to find steady work ever since. She's been living with our parents, which has created a lot of tension because she doesn't contribute to household expenses and spends most of her time sleeping late and going out with friends she can't afford to keep up with. Our parents have been patient with Amber's situation, but they've also been trying to encourage her to take more responsibility for her life. They've set some boundaries about expecting her to look for work and help around the house, which Amber sees as unfair pressure. About a month ago, Amber started talking about needing money for various things. She wanted to get her own apartment, buy a car, and generally have the lifestyle she thought she deserved without having to work for it. When our parents said they couldn't afford to support that kind of independence, Amber got frustrated. Amber has always been drawn to get-rich-quick schemes and dramatic solutions to practical problems. She'd talk about becoming an influencer, starting an online business, or finding some way to make money without traditional employment. Most of her ideas were unrealistic and poorly thought out. 2 weeks ago, Amber started acting strangely secretive. She'd take phone calls in private, spend time on her laptop with the screen angled away from anyone else, and seemed to be planning something she didn't want to discuss with the family. When I asked Amber what she was working on, she'd just say she was trying to figure out her future and that she might have found a solution to her money problems. She seemed excited about whatever plan she was developing, but wouldn't give any details. Last Tuesday, our parents received a terrifying phone call at work. Someone claiming to be holding Amber hostage demanded $10,000 in cash, or they'd hurt her. The caller said they'd grabbed her from the parking lot of a shopping centre and that she was being held somewhere our parents would never find her. My parents were absolutely panicked. They immediately called the police and tried calling Amber's phone, which went straight to voicemail. The kidnapper had told them not to contact authorities, but my parents were too scared to handle the situation alone. The police took the kidnapping reports seriously and began investigating immediately. They traced the ransom call, started checking security cameras at the shopping centre where Amber was supposedly taken, and put out alerts to look for her car. Meanwhile, my parents were beside themselves with worry. They couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't eat, and were preparing to somehow come up with the ransom money, despite not having that kind of cash readily available. They were talking about borrowing against their house or liquidating retirement funds. About 6 hours after the initial ransom call, the police called my parents with an update that completely changed everything. They'd found Amber at a motel across town, very much alive and unharmed, apparently hiding out with her boyfriend who'd made the ransom call. When the police confronted Amber about the fake kidnapping, she initially tried to maintain the story. But when they explained that filing false police reports and attempting to extort money were serious felonies, she broke down and admitted the whole thing had been her idea. Amber had convinced her boyfriend to help her stage the kidnapping so they could get money from our parents. She'd planned to split the ransom payment with him, use her share to get an apartment and start her independent life, then escape from her captors and return home safely. She'd apparently spent days planning the scheme, researching how much ransom money to demand, figuring out where to hide while the investigation was ongoing, and coaching her boyfriend on what to say during the phone call to make it sound legitimate and scary. The police arrested both Amber and her boyfriend for attempted extortion, filing false police reports, and wasting emergency resources. The fake kidnapping had triggered a significant law enforcement response, involving multiple agencies and officers who could have been handling actual emergencies. Our parents were devastated, not just because of the fear and panic they'd experienced, but because they couldn't believe their daughter would put them through such terror for money. They'd been genuinely preparing to bankrupt themselves to save her life. When I visited Amber in jail, she seemed more concerned about the legal consequences she was facing than the emotional trauma she'd caused our family. She kept saying she never meant for things to get so serious, and that she'd just been desperate for money. Amber tried to justify her actions by saying our parents could afford to help her more than they claimed, and that the fake kidnapping was just a way to get them to prioritize her needs. She seemed to think the emotional manipulation was acceptable because she was family. The legal process was embarrassing and expensive for our whole family. Our parents had to hire a lawyer for Amber, deal with media attention when the story became public, and cope with the shame of having their daughter arrested for such a cruel and stupid scheme. Amber ended up pleading guilty to reduced charges and received probation along with community service. She also had to pay restitution for the police resources wasted on her fake emergency, which our parents ended up covering since she had no income. The incident completely destroyed the trust between Amber and our parents. They'd been willing to sacrifice everything to save her life, only to discover that she'd been manipulating their love and fear for financial gain. The betrayal was devastating. Amber moved out of our parents' house after her arrest, though not in the way she'd originally planned. She's been staying with various friends and still struggling to find steady employment, now with a criminal record that makes job hunting even more difficult. Our family relationships have been permanently damaged by Amber's fake kidnapping scheme. Family gatherings are tense and awkward, and our parents have developed anxiety about phone calls and unexpected news because of the trauma they experienced. The whole experience taught me that some people will exploit even their family's deepest fears and love if they think it will get them what they want. Amber's willingness to terrorize our parents for money showed a level of selfishness and cruelty that I never would have expected from my own sister. That story is over. Faking your own kidnapping to extort ransom money from your parents is the kind of sociopathic scheme that permanently destroys family relationships. The fact that she was more worried about legal consequences than the emotional devastation she'd caused shows exactly why she thought terrorizing her own family was acceptable in the first place. Our next story comes from Kayla, who thought a work vacation meant getting away from work entirely. My boss followed me on vacation. He said he was just checking in but showed up at my hotel. I work as a marketing coordinator for a small tech company, and my boss Vincent has always been pretty demanding when it comes to availability and responsiveness. He expects immediate replies to emails, wants to be updated on every project detail, and generally treats his employees like they should be accessible 24 hours a day. I'd been working for the company for about 18 months without taking any real vacation time. Between project deadlines, client demands, and Vincent's expectation that everyone should be constantly available, I never felt like I could take more than a day or two off without falling behind. Finally, I decided I needed a real break and booked a week-long vacation to Hawaii. I'd been saving up for the trip for months, and I was looking forward to spending time on the beach, exploring the island, and completely disconnecting from work stress. I gave Vincent 3 weeks' notice about my vacation dates and made sure all my projects were either completed or properly handed off to other team members. I created detailed documentation for anything that might come up while I was gone, and I even worked late several nights before leaving to make sure nothing would be left hanging. Vincent seemed fine with my vacation plans when I first told him about them, but as the departure date got closer, he started making comments about how busy the office would be while I was gone, and how he hoped nothing urgent would come up that required my specific knowledge. The day before I left, Vincent asked if I'd be checking email while I was in Hawaii. I told him I was planning to disconnect completely and that I'd designated another team member to handle any emergencies. Vincent said that was fine, but suggested I might want to check in occasionally just to make sure everything was running smoothly. My first 3 days in Hawaii were exactly what I'd hoped for. I slept in, spent hours on the beach, explored local restaurants, and felt my stress levels dropping for the first time in months. I didn't check my work email once, and it felt incredible to be completely free from office responsibilities. On the 4th day of my vacation, I was having breakfast at my hotel when I saw someone who looked familiar sitting across the restaurant. When I looked closer, I realised it was Vincent, eating alone while scrolling through his phone like he was conducting business. I was shocked to see him there and assumed it was some kind of incredible coincidence. Hawaii is a popular vacation destination, and maybe Vincent had planned a trip at the same time as mine without mentioning it. I debated whether to go over and say hello or just pretend I hadn't seen him. Vincent noticed me before I could decide what to do. He waved and came over to my table, acting like it was perfectly normal for him to be at my hotel restaurant in Hawaii while I was on vacation. He said he'd been hoping to run into me and asked how I was enjoying my trip. When I asked what brought him to Hawaii, Vincent said he'd decided to take a last-minute vacation and had heard good things about the resort where I was staying. He claimed it was just a coincidence that we'd ended up at the same place, but something about his explanation felt off. Vincent suggested we have dinner together that evening so we could catch up and discuss how things were going back at the office. I politely declined, explaining that I was trying to completely disconnect from work during my vacation and that I'd rather not talk about business while I was trying to relax. But Vincent kept appearing wherever I went in the hotel. When I was at the pool, he'd show up with his laptop, claiming he needed to handle some urgent emails, but wanted to enjoy the nice weather. When I went to the hotel bar, he'd already be there, nursing a drink and working on his phone. After the second day of these coincidental encounters, I started to suspect that Vincent hadn't randomly chosen the same resort as me. When I asked the front desk staff if he'd made his reservation recently, they confirmed that he'd booked his room just 3 days earlier, which was after I'd already been in Hawaii for 2 days. Vincent had somehow found out where I was staying and booked himself into my hotel so he could monitor my vacation and maintain some level of work contact. The realization that my boss had essentially followed me to Hawaii was both creepy and infuriating. When I confronted Vincent about tracking me down on my vacation, he initially denied that he'd planned to find me. But when I mentioned the timing of his reservation, he admitted that he'd been worried about some projects and thought it would be helpful to have a face-to-face conversation while we were both in a relaxed setting. Vincent said he'd noticed that I hadn't been checking emails, and he was concerned that I might be missing important updates or client communications. He claimed he was just trying to be helpful by providing in-person updates so I wouldn't be overwhelmed when I returned to work. I told Vincent that following me on vacation was completely inappropriate and that I'd specifically arranged coverage for my responsibilities so that I could disconnect from work entirely. I said his presence was making it impossible for me to relax and that I needed him to respect my time off. Vincent seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset about his presence. He said he thought I'd appreciate his dedication to keeping me informed, and that most employees would be grateful to have a boss who cared enough to provide personal updates during their vacation. The rest of my trip was ruined by Vincent's presence. Every time I tried to enjoy the beach or explore the island, I'd worry about running into him again. I felt like I was still at work, just in a different location, and I couldn't achieve the mental separation I'd been looking forward to. When we both returned to the office the following week, Vincent acted like nothing unusual had happened. He'd referenced conversations we'd had in Hawaii during team meetings, making it clear to other employees that he'd been in contact with me during my supposed vacation. I realized that Vincent's behavior was a serious violation of work-life boundaries and potentially constituted harassment. I documented everything about his unwelcome presence during my vacation and discussed the situation with HR when I got back. HR was concerned about Vincent's behavior and agreed that following an employee on vacation was inappropriate and potentially illegal. They investigated the incident and determined that Vincent had violated company policies about respecting employee time off. Vincent received a formal reprimand and was required to attend training about appropriate management behaviour and employee boundaries. He was also warned that any future incidents of invading employee personal time could result in termination. The whole experience made me realise that I needed to work for a company that actually respected work-life balance, rather than just paying lip service to it. I started looking for new job opportunities immediately after returning from my ruined vacation. I found a position at a larger company with clear policies about employee time off and managers who understand that vacation means being completely disconnected from work. Vincent's stalking behaviour had actually helped me realize I deserved much better treatment from an employer. That story is over. Your boss literally stalking you to Hawaii and then acting like it's normal workplace behavior is restraining order territory disguised as corporate dedication. The fact that he thought following an employee on vacation showed good management skills proves some people should never be put in charge of anything, let alone other human beings. Let's move to our next story from Adam, who learned that sharing streaming passwords can create unexpected surveillance opportunities. My ex used my Netflix to spy on me. He watched shows I mentioned in conversations just to seem connected. I dated Brandon for about 2 years, and during that time we'd gotten pretty comfortable sharing streaming service passwords. I had Netflix and Hulu, he had Amazon Prime and HBO, and we'd both use each other's accounts to watch whatever we wanted. It seemed like a normal couple thing to do. When Brandon and I broke up 6 months ago, it was relatively amicable. We'd grown apart and realised we wanted different things from life, but there wasn't a lot of drama or anim to stay friends and siosity. We agreed we'd probably hang out occasionally when we were both ready for that kind of relationship. After the breakup, I honestly forgot about all the streaming passwords we'd shared. I was dealing with moving to a new apartment, adjusting to being single again, and generally trying to rebuild my routine without Brandon in it. Changing streaming passwords wasn't exactly a priority. I did notice that my Netflix viewing recommendations seemed a little off for a few weeks after the breakup. The algorithm was suggesting shows and movies that didn't really match my usual preferences, but I figured maybe they'd updated their recommendation system or something. About 2 months after we'd broken up, Brandon and I ran into each other at a coffee shop near my new apartment. We ended up chatting for about an hour, catching up on what we'd both been doing and how we were adjusting to our new lives. During our conversation, I mentioned that I'd been watching this obscure documentary series about Antarctic research that I discovered randomly while browsing Netflix. Brandon immediately lit up and started talking about how fascinating the show was, referencing specific episodes and details that showed he'd obviously watched the entire series. I was surprised that Brandon had found the same random documentary, especially since it wasn't the type of content he'd usually be interested in. When I asked how he'd heard about the show, he said he'd just stumbled across it while browsing and thought it looked interesting. Over the next few weeks, Brandon and I texted occasionally, and I started noticing a pattern in our conversations. Whenever I'd mention a new show or movie I was watching, Brandon would somehow have already seen it and would want to discuss it in detail. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence or that maybe we had more similar taste in entertainment than I'd realised while we were dating. But it was happening too consistently to be random, especially with some of the really obscure content I'd been exploring. The suspicious pattern became obvious when I mentioned watching a Korean horror film that had just been added to Netflix. Brandon immediately started talking about specific scenes and plot points from the movie, but when I asked him about the Korean dialogue and subtitles, he seemed confused. I realised that Brandon must still have access to my Netflix account and was using my viewing history to keep tabs on what I was watching. Then he'd watch the same content so he could bring it up in conversations, making it seem like we had this ongoing connection through shared entertainment interests. When I logged into my Netflix account to check the viewing activity, I found months of content that I hadn't watched. Brandon had been using my account regularly since our breakup, not just to watch his own shows, but specifically to monitor what I was viewing and then watch the same things. The viewing history showed that Brandon would typically watch whatever I'd watched within a day or two of my viewing it. He wasn't just using my account for free entertainment, he was actively tracking my preferences and using that information to maintain conversation topics with me. I felt completely violated by this discovery. Brandon had been essentially spying on my entertainment choices and using that information to create artificial connection points in our post-breakup friendship. Every conversation we'd had about shows and movies had been based on his surveillance of my viewing habits. When I confronted Brandon about using my Netflix account to monitor what I was watching, he initially tried to play it off as no big deal. He said he'd just been curious about my recommendations and thought it was nice that we could still share entertainment interests after breaking up. But when I pointed out that he'd been watching content specifically to create conversation topics with me, Brandon admitted that he'd been hoping we might get back together. He said staying connected through shared viewing experiences felt like a way to maintain our relationship. I explained to Brandon that using my streaming account to spy on my preferences was a violation of privacy, and that artificially creating conversation topics based on surveillance was manipulative. I told him that if he wanted to stay friends, it needed to be based on genuine connection, not secret monitoring. Brandon seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset about his behaviour. He said he thought staying interested in the same entertainment was a way of showing that he still cared about me and wanted to have things to talk about when we interacted. I changed all my streaming passwords immediately and made it clear to Brandon that using my accounts to monitor my activity was not acceptable. I also told him that our friendship needed to be based on honest communication rather than artificial connections created through surveillance. The whole experience made me realise how streaming service sharing can create unexpected privacy vulnerabilities after relationships end. It also showed me that some people will use any available information to maintain connection and control, even in situations where they should be respecting boundaries. Brandon and I haven't maintained our friendship since I discovered his Netflix spying. The trust violation was too significant to overlook, and I realised that someone who would monitor my entertainment choices was probably not respecting other boundaries either. I now make sure to change all shared passwords immediately after any relationship ends, not just for security reasons, but to prevent this kind of intrusive monitoring. The experience taught me that digital privacy is just as important as physical privacy when it comes to maintaining healthy boundaries. That story is over. Using someone's Netflix history as a surveillance tool to manufacture conversation topics is like being stalked by the world's lamest private investigator. The fact that he thought monitoring her viewing habits was a romantic gesture shows how some people confuse obsession with affection. Moving to our next story from Nicole, who discovered that rejection sometimes comes with professional consequences. My dad's friend tried to get me fired. He made fake complaints to my manager because I turned him down. I'm 24 and work as a server at a popular restaurant in my hometown. It's not glamorous work, but the tips are decent, and the schedule gives me flexibility while I'm taking night classes to finish my degree. I've been working there for about 2 years and have a good relationship with my managers and co-workers. My dad's friend Robert has known our family for probably 15 years. He's divorced in his early 50s and has always been a little too friendly with me in a way that made me uncomfortable. When I was younger, he'd make comments about how I was growing up and becoming beautiful that felt inappropriate. As I got older, Robert's attention became more obvious and creepy. He'd ask my dad about my dating life, volunteer to help me with car problems or other issues, and generally try to insert himself into situations where he could spend time with me alone. 3 months ago, Robert came into the restaurant where I work with a group of his friends. I was their server, and throughout the meal, Robert was making comments about my appearance and asking personal questions about my work schedule and life outside the restaurant. When Robert's group was leaving, he asked me what time I got off work and suggested we could grab drinks sometime. I politely declined and said I was too busy with school and work to date anyone right now, especially someone who was friends with my dad. Robert seemed taken aback by my rejection and said he was just trying to be friendly, that he'd known me since I was a kid and was just interested in catching up. But his invitation had clearly been romantic in nature, and my refusal obviously stung his ego. Over the next few weeks, Robert continued coming into the restaurant, usually alone, and would always request to sit in my section. He'd try to engage me in personal conversation while I was working, ask about my classes and future plans, and generally take up more of my time than was appropriate for a customer-server interaction. Robert would also leave unusually large tips, which made me uncomfortable because it felt like he was trying to create some kind of obligation or special relationship between us. When I tried to be more professional and distant, he'd act hurt and ask why I was being cold to him. About a month after his initial dinner invitation, Robert started making subtle complaints about my service whenever he came in. He'd mention to other servers that his food was cold, that I'd been inattentive, or that I'd made mistakes with his order, even when none of these things were true. Initially, I thought Robert was just being difficult because I'd turned him down, but his complaints weren't serious enough to cause real problems for me. My manager Todd knew me well and trusted my work, so he didn't take Robert's minor grievances too seriously. But then Robert's complaints escalated. He started calling the restaurant during busy shifts to report problems with service he'd supposedly received earlier. He'd claim that I'd been rude to him, that I'd spilled something on his table, or that I'd charged him incorrectly for his meal. Robert would also leave negative reviews online mentioning me by name, describing service issues that hadn't actually happened. He'd write detailed complaints about my attitude, my professionalism, and my competence as a server, creating a pattern of documented problems with my performance. The fake complaints started affecting my relationship with management. Todd began questioning me about Robert's reports and asking if there were issues I needed to address in my customer service approach. I tried to explain that Robert was making false accusations, but it was difficult to prove without seeming defensive. When Robert's complaints became frequent enough to warrant a formal discussion, I finally told Todd the truth about Robert's romantic advances and his reaction to my rejection. I explained that the service complaints had started immediately after I'd turned down his invitation for drinks. Todd was concerned about the harassment aspect of the situation, but he was also worried about the restaurant's reputation and the pattern of negative feedback Robert was creating. He said he'd look into the situation, but that I needed to be extra careful about my interactions with Robert. Robert continued his campaign of fake complaints for another 2 weeks, calling the restaurant almost daily with new accusations about my service. He'd report that I'd been late bringing his food, that I'd forgotten items from his order, or that I'd been unprofessional in some way. The constant complaints created a hostile work environment for me. I was stressed about every interaction with customers, worried that any small mistake would be magnified by Robert's ongoing harassment. I was also concerned that Todd was starting to doubt my competence despite my previously excellent track record. Finally, I decided to document Robert's harassment by recording one of his visits to the restaurant. I used my phone to capture him making false complaints about service that had been perfectly normal, proving that his accusations were fabricated. When I showed Todd the recording of Robert making false statements about his dining experience, Todd realized the extent of the harassment I'd been dealing with. He was angry that Robert had been using fake complaints to try to damage my employment and reputation. Todd banned Robert from the restaurant immediately and reported his harassment to corporate management. He also helped me file a police report documenting Robert's campaign of false complaints as a form of workplace harassment and retaliation for rejecting his advances. The police took the situation seriously because Robert's behaviour constituted both sexual harassment and filing false reports that could have damaged my employment. They issued him a warning about continuing to contact me or my workplace with fabricated complaints. When my dad found out what Robert had been doing, he was furious and immediately ended their friendship. He said he was disgusted that someone he trusted around his family had been harassing his daughter and trying to get her fired for rejecting his inappropriate advances. Robert's harassment campaign had lasted almost 2 months and had caused significant stress in my work life. Even after he was banned from the restaurant, it took time to rebuild trust with management and shake off the anxiety his false complaints had created. The experience taught me that some people will use whatever power or influence they have to retaliate when their advances are rejected. Robert's willingness to potentially cost me my job over his wounded ego showed a level of vindictiveness I hadn't expected from someone my family had trusted. I'm more cautious now about how I handle unwanted attention, especially from older men who might have connections to my workplace or family. The incident showed me that professional retaliation for personal rejection is a real threat that women have to navigate carefully. That story is over. Trying to destroy someone's livelihood because they won't date you is predatory behaviour disguised as customer feedback. The fact that he thought he could weaponize Yelp reviews and fake complaints to punish a woman for having standards shows exactly why she was right to reject him in the first place. Our next story comes from Tom, who learned that some roommates have very loose definitions of what constitutes important mail. My roommate threw away my passport. She said she thought it was expired mail. I live with my roommate Christina in a 2-bedroom apartment downtown. We've been sharing the space for about 8 months, and generally, we get along fine. She's neat, pays her bills on time, and we don't really get in each other's way since we have different work schedules. Christina has always been particular about keeping our apartment organised and clutter-free. She's constantly cleaning, organising mail, and making sure everything has its proper place. Usually, I appreciate her tidiness, but sometimes her need for order can be a bit overwhelming. Last month, I applied for a new job that would require some international travel. As part of the application process, I needed to renew my passport, which had expired about 6 months earlier. I submitted all the renewal paperwork and was told it would take about 4 weeks to receive the new document. I'd been checking our mailbox regularly, waiting for the passport to arrive. Christina usually brings in the mail since she gets home from work before I do, and she sorts it on our kitchen counter with each person's mail in separate piles. 3 weeks after submitting my passport renewal, I still hadn't received anything from the State Department. I called their customer service line to check on the status, and they confirmed that my new passport had been mailed to my address 5 days earlier. When I asked Christina if she'd seen any official-looking mail from the government, she said she hadn't noticed anything unusual. She suggested maybe the postal service had delivered it to the wrong address, or that it might arrive in the next day or two. I waited another week, but the passport never appeared. I called the State Department again, and they confirmed the document had been delivered according to their tracking information. They said I'd need to report it as lost and go through the replacement process, which would take several more weeks. The job opportunity had a tight deadline for providing proof of passport validity, so losing the document was potentially going to cost me the position. I was frustrated and stressed about having to start the replacement process over again. When I mentioned to Christina that I'd need to file a police report about the missing passport, she suddenly got nervous and said maybe we should check through all the mail more carefully. She suggested that perhaps it had gotten mixed in with advertisements or catalogues by mistake. We spent an hour going through every piece of mail in our apartment, including old magazines and junk mail that Christina usually recycled immediately. We didn't find the passport, but Christina's behaviour was making me suspicious that she knew more than she was telling me. Finally, I asked Christina directly if she'd seen my passport and maybe put it somewhere for safekeeping. She got defensive and said she would never interfere with my important mail and that she was insulted I'd suggest she was lying about it. But her reaction seemed overly emotional for a simple question, so I pressed her for more details about what she did with mail that she didn't immediately recognise. That's when Christina broke down and admitted she'd thrown away what she thought was an expired government document. According to Christina, she'd received a thick envelope from the State Department about a week earlier and had assumed it was some kind of renewal notice for an expired document. She said she'd glanced at it quickly, saw that it was addressed to me, but thought it looked like the kind of government mail that people usually ignore. Christina had thrown the unopened envelope directly into the trash without asking me about it or setting it aside for me to review. She said she'd been trying to keep our counter clear of clutter and had assumed I'd know if I was expecting something important. I was furious that Christina had thrown away my passport without even opening the envelope or asking me about it. The document had cost me over $100 to renew, and now I'd have to go through the entire replacement process again, which would take weeks and cost additional fees. When I asked Christina why she thought she had the right to decide what mail was important enough to keep, she said she'd just been trying to help keep our apartment organised. She claimed she threw away obvious junk mail for both of us regularly and hadn't realised this envelope was different. But a thick envelope from the US State Department addressed to me personally was clearly not junk mail, and Christina's decision to discard it without consultation was completely inappropriate. She'd essentially stolen and destroyed a government document that belonged to me. Christina offered to pay for the replacement fees, but that didn't solve the timing problem with my job application. The new position required proof of passport validity within 2 weeks, and the replacement process would take at least 4 weeks, even with expedited service. I had to contact the potential employer and explain that my passport had been accidentally destroyed by my roommate. They were understanding about the situation, but couldn't extend their deadline, so I lost the opportunity because of Christina's interference with my mail. The whole situation created a lot of tension between Christina and me. I couldn't trust her judgment about what was important, and she was defensive about her actions rather than taking full responsibility for the consequences of throwing away my passport. Christina kept insisting that it was an honest mistake and that she'd been trying to be helpful by managing the mail clutter. But throwing away unopened mail addressed to someone else, especially official government documents, showed a complete lack of respect for my property and privacy. I made it clear to Christina that she was never to touch my mail again, regardless of what it looked like or how cluttered the counter got. I also started having all-important documents delivered to my workplace to avoid any future incidents of her helpful mail management. The replacement passport process took 6 weeks and cost me an additional $200 in expedited fees and overnight shipping. Christina did pay for the replacement costs, but she couldn't compensate me for the lost job opportunity or the stress her actions had caused. Looking back, I realise I should have been more explicit about mail handling expectations when we first became roommates, but I never imagined someone would throw away unopened mail addressed to another person without at least asking about it first. That story is over. Throwing away someone's unopened government mail because you think you know what's best for apartment organisation is roommate overreach at its most expensive. The fact that she destroyed a passport and cost him a job opportunity while claiming to be helpful shows how good intentions can still make someone a terrible person to live with. Moving to our next story from Mia, who discovered that some family members think engagement rings come with inheritance clauses. My aunt tried to take my engagement ring. She claimed it belonged to the family. I got engaged to my boyfriend Peter 6 months ago, and he proposed with the most beautiful vintage ring he'd found at an estate sale. It's an Art Deco style diamond ring from the 1920s with intricate metalwork and a unique setting that I absolutely fell in love with the moment I saw it. Peter had spent months looking for the perfect ring, visiting different antique shops and estate sales to find something with character and history. When he found this particular ring, he said he immediately knew it was meant for me because it matched my love of vintage jewellery and unique pieces. The ring isn't enormously valuable from a monetary standpoint, but it's beautiful and meaningful to me because of the thought Peter put into finding something that reflected my personal style. I've been wearing it proudly and showing it off to family and friends who've all been excited about our engagement. My Aunt Diane has always been interested in jewellery and antiques, and when she saw my engagement ring at a family dinner last month, she was immediately fascinated by it. She spent a long time examining it, asking questions about where Peter had found it and how much he'd paid for it. Diane seemed to know quite a bit about the style and era of the ring, which I thought was just her general knowledge about antique jewellery. She made comments about how rings like mine were becoming increasingly rare and valuable, and how lucky I was to have found such a special piece. A few days after the family dinner, Diane called me and asked if she could see the ring again. She said she'd been thinking about it since our dinner and wanted to take some photos of it because she was interested in the craftsmanship and design details. When Diane came over to look at the ring again, she brought a magnifying glass and spent a lot of time examining the inside of the band and the settings of the stones. She seemed to be looking for something specific. taking notes and comparing what she saw to information she had on her phone. After about an hour of examining the ring, Diane sat me down and said she had something important to tell me about it. She claimed that the ring looked exactly like one that had belonged to our family decades ago, and that she believed Peter had unknowingly purchased a piece of our family heritage. According to Diane, the ring had belonged to our great-grandmother and had been passed down through several generations of women in our family before mysteriously disappearing about 30 years ago. She said she'd been researching our family history and had old photos that showed the ring being worn by various relatives. Diane showed me some grainy black and white photographs on her phone that she claimed proved the ring's family connection. The photos were old and unclear, but she insisted that the ring in the pictures was identical to mine in every detail. I was skeptical about Diane's claims because the timing seemed suspicious. She'd never mentioned this family heirloom before, and it was convenient that she'd suddenly remembered it after seeing my engagement ring. When I asked Diane how she could be so certain that my ring was the same one from the old family she'd been doing genealogy research and photos, she said, had documentation about, had been jewellery that passed down through our family line. Diane then made a request that completely shocked me. She asked if I would consider giving the ring back to the family, since it had supposedly been stolen or lost decades ago and rightfully belonged to our relatives rather than to me personally. I told Diane that even if the ring had once belonged to our family, Peter had purchased it legally from an estate sale, and it was now my engagement ring. I said I had no intention of giving up the ring that my fiancé had chosen for me. Diane became more persistent, arguing that family heirlooms should stay within the family, regardless of how they'd been acquired by outsiders. She said it was my responsibility to return stolen family property, even if I'd known hadn't about its history when I received it. She offered to reimburse Peter for what he'd paid for the ring, saying the family would pull money together to buy it back from us. Diane acted like this was a generous compromise rather than an unreasonable demand to give up my engagement ring. When I continued to refuse, Diane started making threats about involving other family members in the dispute. She said she'd tell everyone at the next family gathering about how I was keeping stolen family jewellery and refusing to do the right thing. I asked Diane to provide concrete proof that my ring was actually the same one from her old family photos, rather than just a similar style from the same era. She couldn't offer any definitive evidence beyond her claims and the unclear photographs. Peter was furious when I told him about Diane's demands. He said he'd researched the ring's provenance when he bought it, and that the estate sale had been legitimate with proper documentation. He was insulted that Diane was implying he'd unknowingly purchased stolen goods. Diane continued pressuring me for several weeks, calling regularly and showing up at family events with more evidence about the ring's supposed family connection. She'd bring different relatives into the conversation, trying to build support for her claim. Finally, I told Diane that if she truly believed the ring had been stolen from our family, she should contact the police and let them investigate her claims through proper legal channels. I said I wasn't going to give up my engagement ring based on her speculation and unclear photographs. Diane never contacted the police about her supposed stolen family heirloom, which confirmed my suspicion that her claims weren't legitimate. She'd been trying to manipulate me into giving her a valuable antique ring by creating a false story about family ownership. The whole situation created tension at family gatherings, with Diane continuing to make passive-aggressive comments about people who keep things that don't belong to them. But without any real evidence to support her claims, most family members recognized her behavior as inappropriate. That story is over. Creating an elaborate family history conspiracy to steal someone's engagement ring is peak relative manipulation. The fact that she never actually called the police when challenged tells you everything about how stolen she really thought it was. Our next story comes from Ben, who discovered that some co-workers have very creative fundraising strategies. My co-worker lied about being homeless. He got everyone to donate, but he was secretly living in a luxury condo. I work at a mid-sized accounting firm where most of us have gotten pretty close over the years. We're the kind of office where people genuinely care about each other's lives outside of work, and we've always been quick to help out when someone's going through a tough time. About 4 months ago, my co-worker Travis started showing subtle signs that he might be struggling financially. He'd mentioned not being able to afford lunch, would decline after-work drinks because money was tight, and generally seemed stressed about his living situation. Travis had always been pretty private about his personal life, so when he started opening up about financial difficulties, it felt significant. He'd make comments about having to choose between paying bills and buying groceries, or mention looking for a second job to make ends meet. The situation seemed to escalate quickly. Travis started coming to work, looking tired and disheveled, saying he wasn't sleeping well because he was worried about making rent. He'd eat vending machine snacks for lunch and claim he was trying to save money wherever possible. One particularly difficult week, Travis confided in our supervisor Janet that he'd been evicted from his apartment and was temporarily staying in his car while he tried to find affordable housing. He seemed genuinely embarrassed about his situation and asked Janet not to make a big deal about it. Of course, word spread quickly through our small office. Everyone was concerned about Travis sleeping in his car, especially with winter approaching. Janet organised an informal meeting to discuss how we could help our colleague through this rough patch. We decided to take up a collection to help Travis get back on his feet. Everyone contributed what they could, from $20 to a few hundred, depending on their own financial situation. We raised almost $3,000 in just a few days. Travis was overwhelmed with emotion when Janet presented him with the money. He actually started crying and said he couldn't believe how generous and caring his co-workers were. He promised to pay everyone back once he got his finances straightened out. We also helped Travis in other ways. People brought him homemade meals, offered to let him shower at their houses, and even suggested he could sleep on someone's couch until he found a new place. The whole office rallied around him during what seemed like a genuinely difficult time. About 2 weeks after we'd given Travis the money, I was driving through an upscale part of town when I saw something that made me do a double take. Travis was walking out of a luxury condominium building, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying shopping bags from high-end stores. I assumed there must be some explanation. Maybe he was visiting someone, or maybe he'd gotten a job interview and had borrowed nice clothes, but something about the way he moved through the area suggested familiarity, like he belonged there. My curiosity got the better of me, so I parked across the street and waited to see what Travis would do next. About 20 minutes later, he came back out of the building and got into a brand new car that I'd never seen him drive to work. Well, here we are at the end of another sleepless night journey through the wildest corners of human behaviour. These stories remind us that somewhere out there, in apartments and offices and family homes just like ours, people are making decisions that would make the rest of us question reality itself. Whether you found comfort in knowing your problems aren't quite this chaotic, or you're lying there realizing your own life might be someone else's Reddit story, at least we're all in this together. Sleep well if you can. If